The Enigma of Arrival. By V.S. Naipaul. Jack's Garden. For the first 4 days it rained. I could hardly see where I was. Then it stopped raining, and beyond the lawn and outbuildings in front of my cottage I saw fields with stripped trees on the boundaries of each field, and far away, depending on the light, glints of a little river, glints which sometimes appeared, oddly, to be above the level of the land. The river was called the Avon, not the one connected with Shakespeare. Later, when the land had more meaning, when it had absorbed more of my life than the tropical street where I had grown up, I was able to think of the flat wet fields with the ditches as water meadows, or wet meadows, and the low smooth hills in the background, beyond the river, as downs. But just then, after the rain, all that I saw, though I had been living in England for 20 years, were flat fields and a narrow river. It was winter. This idea of winter and snow had always excited me, but in England the word had lost some of its romance for me, because the winters I had found in England had seldom been as extreme as I had imagined they would be when I was far away in my tropical island. I had experienced severe weather in other places, in Spain in January, in a skiing resort near Madrid, in India, in Simla in December, and in the high Himalayas in August. But in England this kind of weather hardly seemed to come. In England I wore the same kind of clothes all through the year, seldom wore a pullover, hardly needed an overcoat. And though I knew that summers were sunny and that in winter the trees went bare and brush-like, as in the watercolors of Roland Hilder, the year, so far as vegetation and even temperature went, was a blur to me. It was hard for me to distinguish one section or season from the other. I didn't associate flowers or the foliage of trees with any particular month. And yet I liked to look. I noticed everything, and could be moved by the beauty of trees and flowers and early sunny mornings and late light evenings. Winter was to me a time mainly of short days, and of electric lights everywhere at working hours, also a time when snow was a possibility. If I say it was winter when I arrived at that house in the river valley, it is because I remember the mist, the 4 days of rain and mist that hid my surroundings from me and answered my anxiety at the time, anxiety about my work and this move to a new place, yet another of the many moves I had made in England. It was winter, too, because I was worried about the cost of heating. In the cottage there was only electricity, more expensive than gas or oil. And the cottage was hard to heat. It was long and narrow. It was not far from the water meadows and the river, and the concrete floor was just a foot or so above the ground. And then one afternoon it began to snow. Snow dusted the lawn in front of my cottage, dusted the bare branches of the trees, outlined disregarded things, outlined the empty, old-looking buildings around the lawn that I hadn't yet paid attention to or fully taken in, so that piece by piece, while I considered the falling snow, a rough picture of my setting built up around me. Rabbits came out to play on the snow or to feed. A mother rabbit, hunched, with 3 or 4 of her young. They were a different, dirty color on the snow. And this picture of the rabbits, or more particularly their new color, calls up or creates the other details of the winter's day, the late afternoon snow light, the strange, empty houses around the lawn becoming white and distinct and more important. It also calls up the memory of the forest I thought I saw behind the whitening hedge against which the rabbits fed. The white lawn, the empty houses around it, the hedge to one side of the lawn, the gap in the hedge, a path, the forest beyond. I saw a forest. But it wasn't a forest really. It was only the old orchard at the back of the big house in whose grounds my cottage was. I saw what I saw very clearly. But I didn't know what I was looking at. I had nothing to fit it into. I was still in a kind of limbo. There were certain things I knew, though. I knew the name of the town I had come to by the train. It was Salisbury. It was almost the first English town I had got to know, the first I had been given some idea of, from the reproduction of the Constable painting of Salisbury Cathedral in my 3rd Standard Reader. Far away in my tropical island, before I was 10. A 4-color reproduction which I had thought the most beautiful picture I had ever seen. I knew that the house I had come to was in one of the river valleys near Salisbury. Apart from the romance of the Constable reproduction, the knowledge I brought to my setting was linguistic. I knew that Avon originally meant only river, just as hound originally just meant a dog, any kind of dog. And I knew that both elements of Waldeshaw, the name of the village and the manor in whose grounds I was, I knew that both Walden and Shaw meant wood. One further reason why, apart from the fairy tale feel of the snow and the rabbits, I thought I saw a forest. I also knew that the house was near Stonehenge. I knew there was a walk which took one near the stone circle. I knew that somewhere high up on this walk there was a viewing point. And when the rain stopped and the mist lifted, after those first 4 days, I went out one afternoon, looking for the walk and the view. There was no village to speak of. I was glad of that. I would have been nervous to meet people. After all my time in England, I still had that nervousness in a new place, that rawness of response, still felt myself to be in the other man's country, felt my strangeness, my solitude. And every excursion into a new part of the country, what for others might have been an adventure, was for me like a tearing at an old scab. The narrow public road ran beside the dark, yew-screened grounds of the manor. Just beyond the road in the wire fence, and the roadside scrub, the downs sloped sharply upwards. Stonehenge and the walk lay in that direction. There would have been a lane or path leading off the public road. To find that lane or path, was I to turn left or right? There was no problem, really. You came to a lane if you turned left, you came to another lane if you turned right. Those 2 lanes met at Jack's cottage, or the old farmyard where Jack's cottage was, in the valley over the hill. 2 ways to the cottage. Different ways, one was very old, and one was new. The old way was longer, flatter, it followed an old, wide, winding riverbed. It would have been used by carts in the old days. The new way, meant for machines, was steeper, up the hill and then directly down again. You came to the old way if you turned left on the public road. This stretch of road was overhung by beeches. It ran on a ledge in the down just above the river, and then it dropped almost to the level of the river. A little settlement here, just a few houses. I noticed a small old house of brick and flint with a fine portico, and on the river bank, very close to the water, a low, white-walled thatched cottage that was being done up. Years later that cottage was still being done up. Half-used sacks of cement were still to be seen through the dusty windows. Here, in this settlement, you turned off into the old way to Jack's cottage. An asphalt lane led past half a dozen ordinary little houses, 2 or 3 of which carried, their only fanciful touch, the elaborate monogram of the owner or builder or designer, with the date, which was, surprisingly, a date from the war, 1944. The asphalt gave out, the narrow lane became rocky, then, entering a valley, became wide, with many flinty wheeled ruts separated by uneven strips of coarse, tufted grass. This valley felt old. To the left the steep slope shut out a further view. This slope was bare, without trees or scrub. Below its smooth, thin covering of grass could be seen lines and stripes, like wheels, suggesting many consecutive years of tilling a long time ago, suggesting also fortifications. The wide way twisted, the wide valley, possibly an ancient river course, which the way occupied then ran straight and far, bounded in the distance by the beginning of a low down. Jack's cottage and the farmyard were at the end of that straight way, where the way turned. The other way to the cottage, the shorter, steeper, newer way, up from the main road and then down to the valley and the farmyard, was lined on the northern side with a windbreak, young beech trees protected by taller pines. At the top of the slope there was a modern, metal-walled barn. Just a little way down on the other side there was a gap in the windbreak. This was the viewing point for Stonehenge, far away, small, not easy to see, not as easy as the luminous red or orange targets of the army firing ranges. And at the bottom of the slope, down the rocky, uneven lane beside the windbreak, were the derelict farm buildings and the still living row of agricultural cottages, one of which Jack lived in. The downs all around were flinty and dry, whitish brown, whitish green. But on the wide way at the bottom, around the farm buildings, the ground was muddy and black. The tractor wheels had dug out irregular linear ponds in the black mud. The first afternoon, when I reached the farm buildings, walking down the steep way, beside the windbreak, I had to ask the way to Stonehenge. From the viewing point at the top, it had seemed clear. But from that point down had risen against down, slope against slope, dips and paths had been hidden, and at the bottom, where mud and long puddles made walking difficult and made the spaces seem bigger, and there appeared to be many paths, some leading off the wide valley way, I was confused. Such a simple inquiry, though, in the emptiness, and I never forgot that on the first day I had asked someone the way. Was it Jack? I didn't take the person in. I was more concerned with the strangeness of the walk, my own strangeness, and the absurdity of my inquiry. I was told to go round the farm buildings, to turn to the right, to stick to the wide main way, and to ignore all the tempting dry paths that led off the main way to the woods which lay on the other side, young woods that falsely suggested deep country, the beginning of forest. So, past the mud around the cottages and the farmyard, past the mess of old timber, and tangled old barbed wire and apparently abandoned pieces of farm machinery, I turned right. The wide muddy way became grassy, long wet grass. And soon, when I had left the farm buildings behind and felt myself walking in a wide, empty, old riverbed, the sense of space was overwhelming. The grassy way, the old riverbed, as I thought, sloped up, so that the eye was led to the middle sky, and on either side were the slopes of the downs, widening out and up against the sky. On one side there were cattle, on the other side, beyond a pasture, a wide empty area, there were young pines, a little forest. The setting felt ancient, the impression was of space, unoccupied land, the beginning of things. There were no houses to be seen, only the wide grassy way, the sky above it, and the wide slopes on either side. It was possible on this stretch of the walk to hold on to the idea of emptiness. But when I got to the top of the grassy way and was on a level with the barrows and tumuli which dotted the high downs all around, and I looked down at Stonehenge, I saw also the firing ranges of Salisbury Plain and the many little neat houses of West Amesbury. The emptiness, the spaciousness through which I had felt myself walking was as much an illusion as the idea of forest behind the young pines. All around, and not far away, were roads and highways, with brightly colored trucks and cars like toys. Stonehenge, old barrows and tumuli outlined against the sky, the army firing ranges, West Amesbury. The old and the new, and from a midway or a different time, the farmyard with Jack's cottage at the bottom of the valley. Many of the farm buildings were no longer used. The barns and pens, red brick walls, roofs of slate or clay tiles, around the muddy yard were in decay, and only occasionally in the pens were there cattle, sick cattle, enfeebled calves, isolated from the herd. Fallen tiles, holed roofs, rusted corrugated iron, bent metal, a pervading damp, the colors rust and brown and black, with a glittering or dead green moss on the trampled, dung-softened mud of the pen yard, the isolation of the animals in that setting, like things themselves about to be discarded, was terrible. Once there were cattle there that had suffered from some malformation. The breeding of these cattle had become so mechanical that the malformation appeared mechanical too, the mistakes of an industrial process. Curious additional lumps of flesh had grown at various places on the animals, as though these animals had been cast in a mold divided into two sections, and as though, at the joining of the molds, the cattle material, the mixture out of which the cattle were being cast, had leaked, and had hardened, matured into flesh, and had then developed hair with the black and white Frisian pattern of the rest of the cattle. There, in the ruined, abandoned, dungy, mossy farmyard, fresh now only with their own dung, they had stood, burdened in this puzzling way, with this extra cattle material hanging down their middles like a bull's dewlaps, like heavy curtains, waiting to be taken off to the slaughterhouse in the town. Away from the old farm buildings, and down the wide flat way which I thought of as the old road to the farm and Jack's cottage, there were other remnants and ruins, relics of other efforts or lives. At the end of the wide way, to one side of it in tall grass, were flat shallow boxes, painted gray, set down in 2 rows. I was told later that they were or had been beehives. I was never told who it was who had kept the bees. Was it a farm worker, someone from the cottages, or was it someone more leisured, attempting a little business enterprise and then giving up and forgetting? Abandoned now, unexplained, the gray boxes that were worth no one's while to take away were a little mysterious in the unfenced openness. On the other side of the wide droveway, its great curve round the farm buildings just beginning here. In the shelter of young trees and scrub there was an old green and yellow and red caravan in good condition, a brightly painted gypsy caravan of the old days, as I thought, looking as if its horses had been unhitched not long before. Another mystery, another carefully made thing abandoned, another piece of the past that no longer had a use but had not been thrown away. Like the antiquated, cumbersome pieces of farm machinery scattered and rusting about the farm buildings. Midway down the straight wide way, far beyond the beehives and the caravan, was an old hayrick, with bales of hay stacked into a cottage-shaped structure and covered with old black plastic sheeting. The hay had grown old. Out of its blackness there were green sprouts. The hay that had been carefully cut one summer and baled and stored was decaying, turning to manure. The hay of the farm was now stored in a modern open shed, a prefabricated structure which carried the printed name of the maker just below the apex of the roof. The shed had been erected just beyond the mess of the old farmyard, as though space would always be available, and nothing old need ever be built over. The hay in this shed was new, with a sweet, warm smell, and the bales unstacked into golden, clean, warm-smelling steps, which made me think of the story about spinning straw into gold and of references in books with European settings to men sleeping on straw in barns. That had never been comprehensible to me in Trinidad, where grass was always freshly cut for cattle, always green, and never browned into hay. Now, in winter, at the bottom of this damp valley, high-stacked golden hay bales, warm golden steps next to rutted black mud. Not far from the decaying rick shaped like a hut or cottage there were the remains of a true house, a house with walls that might have been of flint and concrete. A simple house, its walls perhaps without foundations, it was now quite exposed. Ruined walls, roofless, around bare earth, no sign of a stone or concrete floor. How damp it felt! All around the plot the boundary trees, sycamore or beech or oak, had grown tall, dwarfing the house. Once they would have been barely noticeable, the trees that, living on while the house had ceased to be, now kept the ground chill and mossy and black and in perpetual shadow. Smaller houses beside the public roads, houses built by squatters in the last century, farm laborers mainly, had established ownership rights for the builders and their descendants. But here, beside the grassy droveway, in the middle of downs and fields and solitude, the owner or the builder of the house had left nothing behind. Nothing had been established. Only the trees he had planted had continued to grow. Perhaps the house had been no more than a shepherd's shelter. But that was only a guess. Shepherds' huts would have been smaller, and the trees around the plot didn't speak of a shepherd's hut, didn't speak of a man lodging there for only a few nights at a time. Sheep were no longer the main animals of the plain. I saw a sheep shearing only once. It was done by a big man, an Australian, I was told, and the shearing was done in one of the old buildings, timber walls and a slate roof, at the side of the cottage row in which Jack lived. I saw the shearing by accident. I had heard nothing about it. It just happened at the time of my afternoon walk. But the shearing had clearly been news for some. The farm people and people from elsewhere as well had gathered to watch. A display of strength and speed, the fleecy animal lifted and shorn, and sometimes cut, at the same time, and then sent off, oddly naked. The ceremony was like something out of an old novel, perhaps by Hardy, or out of a Victorian country diary. And it was as though, then, the firing ranges of Salisbury Plain, and the vapor trails of military aircraft in the sky, and the army houses and the roaring highways didn't lie around us. As though, in that little spot around the farm buildings and Jack's cottage, time had stood still, and things were as they had been, for a little while. But the sheep shearing was from the past. Like the old farm buildings. Like the caravan that wasn't going to move again. Like the barn where grain was no longer stored. This barn had a high window with a projecting metal bracket. Perhaps a pulley wheel and a chain or rope had been attached to this metal bracket to lift bales off the carts and wagons and then swing them through the high open window into the barn. There was a similar antique fixture in the town of Salisbury, at the upper level of what had been a well-known old grocery shop. It had survived or been allowed to live on as an antique, a trademark, something suited to an old town careful of its past. But what was an antique in the town was rubbish at the bottom of the hill. It was part of a barn that was crumbling winter by winter, the barn and the other dilapidated farm buildings no doubt allowed to survive because, in this protected area, planning regulations allowed new buildings to go up only where buildings existed. And just as the modern prefabricated shed had replaced the old rotting hayrick, so, but far away, not a simple addition to the old farm buildings, the true barn was now at the top of the hill, beside the windbreak. It had galvanized tin walls. It would have been rat-proof. Their machinery caused everything to go, and the powerful trucks, not nowadays the wagons that might have used the flat droveway to the old barn at the bottom of the valley, climbed up the rocky lane from the public road and pulled into the concrete yard of the barn, and the spout from the barn poured the dusty grain into the deep trays of the trucks. The straw was golden, warm. The grain was golden, but the dust that fell all around, on the concrete yard, the rocky lane, the pines and young beeches of the windbreak, the dust that fell after the grain had poured into the trays of the trucks was gray. At the side of the metal-walled barn, and below a metal spout, there was a conical mound of dust that had been winnowed by some mechanical means from the bigger conical mounds of grain in the barn. This dust, the mound firm at the base, wonderfully soft at the top, was very fine and gray, without a speck of gold. New, this barn, with all its mechanical contrivances. But just next to it, across an unpaved muddy lane, was another ruin, a wartime bunker, a mound planted over with sycamores, for concealment, and with a metal ventilator sticking out oddly now among the trunks of the grown trees. The sycamores would have been planted at least 25 years before, but they had been planted close together, and they still looked young. Jack lived among ruins, among superseded things. But that way of looking came to me later, has come to me with greater force now, with the writing. It wasn't the idea that came to me when I first went out walking. That idea of ruin and dereliction, of out-of-placeness, was something I felt about myself, attached to myself, a man from another hemisphere, another background, coming to rest in middle life in the cottage of a half-neglected estate, an estate full of reminders of its Edwardian past, with few connections with the present. An oddity among the estates and big houses of the valley, and a further oddity in its grounds. I felt unanchored and strange. Everything I saw in those early days, as I took my surroundings in, everything I saw on my daily walk, beside the windbreak, or along the wide grassy way, made that feeling more acute. I felt that my presence in that old valley was part of something like an upheaval, a change in the course of the history of the country. Jack himself, however, I considered to be part of the view. I saw his life as genuine, rooted, fitting man fitting the landscape. I saw him as a remnant of the past, the undoing of which my own presence portended. It did not occur to me, when I first went walking and saw only the view, took what I saw as things of that walk, things that one might see in the countryside near Salisbury, immemorial, appropriate things, it did not occur to me that Jack was living in the middle of junk, among the ruins of nearly a century, that the past around his cottage might not have been his past, that he might at some stage have been a newcomer to the valley, that his style of life might have been a matter of choice, a conscious act, that out of the little piece of earth which had come to him with his farm worker's cottage, one of a row of 3, he had created a special land for himself, a garden, where, though surrounded by ruins, reminders of vanished lives, he was more than content to live out his life and where, as in a version of a book of hours, he celebrated the seasons. I saw him as a remnant. Not far away, among the ancient barrows and tumuli, were the firing ranges and army training grounds of Salisbury Plain. There was a story that because of the absence of people in those military areas, because of the purely military uses to which the land had been put for so long, and contrary to what one might expect after the explosions and mock warfare, there survived on the plains some kinds of butterflies that had vanished in more populated parts. And I thought that in some such fashion, in the wide droveway at the bottom of the valley, accidentally preserved from people, traffic, and the military, Jack, like the butterflies, had survived. I saw things slowly, they emerged slowly. It was not Jack whom I first noticed on my walks. It was Jack's father-in-law. And it was the father-in-law, rather than Jack, who seemed a figure of literature in that ancient landscape. He seemed a Wordsworthian figure, bent, exaggeratedly bent, going gravely about his peasant tasks, as if in an immense Lake District solitude. He walked very slowly, the bent old man. He did everything very deliberately. He had worked out his own paths across the downs and he stuck to them. You could follow these paths even across barbed wire fences, by the blue plastic sacks, originally containing fertilizer, which the old man had rolled around the barbed wire and then tied very tightly with red nylon string, working with a thoroughness that matched his pace and deliberateness to create these safe padded places where he could cross below the barbed wire or climb over it. The old man first, then. And after him, the garden in the midst of superseded things. It was Jack's garden that made me notice Jack. The people in the other cottages I never got to know, couldn't recognize, never knew when they moved in or moved out. But it took some time to see the garden. So many weeks, so many walks between the whitish chalk and flint hills up to the level of the barrows to look down at Stonehenge, so many walks just looking for hares. It took some time before, with the beginning of my new awareness of the seasons, I noticed the garden. Until then it had simply been there, something on the walk, a marker, not to be specially noticed. And yet I loved landscape, trees, flowers, clouds, and was responsive to changes of light and temperature. I noticed his hedge first of all. It was well clipped, tight in the middle, but ragged in places at ground level. I felt, from the clipping, that the gardener would have liked that hedge to be tight all over, to be as complete as a wall of brick or timber or some kind of man-fashioned material. The hedge marked the boundary between Jack's fruit and flower garden and the droveway, which was very wide here, bare ground around the cottages and the farm buildings, and nearly always soft or muddy. In winter the long puddles reflected the sky between black, tractor-marked mud. For a few days in summer that black mud dried out, turned hard and white and dusty. So for a few days in the summer the hedge that ran the length of the garden that Jack possessed with his cottage was white with chalk dust for a foot or so above the ground. In winter it was spattered with mud, drying out white or gray. The hedge hid nothing. As you came down the hill with the windbreak you could see it all. The old rust and black farm buildings in the background, the gray plastered cottages in front of them, the ground or gardens in front of the cottages, the emptiness or no man's land in front of the cottage grounds or gardens. And beside Jack's garden, Jack's hedge, a little wall of mud-spattered green, abrupt in the openness of the droveway, like a vestige, a memory of another kind of house and garden and street, a token of something more complete, more ideal. Technically, the gardens were at the front of the cottages. In fact, by long use, the back of the cottages had become the front, and the front gardens had really become back gardens. But Jack, with the same instinct that made him grow and carefully clip, and also abruptly end, that hedge beside the droveway, treated his garden like a front garden. A paved path with a border of some sort ran from his front door all the way down the middle of his garden. This should have led to a gate, a pavement, a street. There was a gate, but this gate, set in a wide meshed wire netting fence, led only to a wire-fenced patch of earth which was forked over every year. It was here that Jack planted out his annuals. In front of this was the empty area, the no-man's land between droveway and the beginning of the cultivated down. Jack's ducks and geese had their sheds in that area, which was messy with dung and feathers. Though they were not penned in, the ducks and geese never strayed far. They just walked back and forth across the droveway. Hedge, garden, planting out bed for annuals, a plot for ducks and geese, and beyond that, beyond the ground reserved for the other two cottages, just where the land began to slope up to the farm's machine-cultivated fields, was the area where Jack grew his vegetables. Every piece of ground was separate. Jack didn't see his setting as a whole, but he saw its component parts very clearly, and everything he tended answered the special idea he had of that thing. The hedge was regularly clipped, the garden was beautiful and clean and full of changing color, and the goose plot was dirty, with roughly built sheds and enamel basins and bowls and discarded earthenware sinks. Like a medieval village in miniature, all the various pieces of the garden Jack had established around the old farm buildings. This was Jack's style, and it was this that suggested to me, falsely, as I got to know soon enough, the remnant of an old peasantry, surviving here like the butterflies among the explosions of Salisbury Plain, surviving somehow industrial revolution, deserted villages, railways, and the establishing of the great agricultural estates in the valley. So much of this I saw with the literary eye, or with the aid of literature. A stranger here, with the nerves of the stranger, and yet with a knowledge of the language and the history of the language and the writing, I could find a special kind of past in what I saw. With a part of my mind I could admit fantasy. I heard on the radio one morning that in the days of the Roman Empire geese could be walked to market all the way from the province of Gaul to Rome. After this, the high-headed, dung-dropping geese that strutted across the muddy, rutted way at the bottom of the valley and could be quite aggressive at times, Jack's geese, developed a kind of historical life for me, something that went beyond the idea of medieval peasantry, old English country ways, and the drawings of geese in children's books. And when one year, longing for Shakespeare, longing to be put in touch with the early language, I returned to King Lear for the first time for more than 20 years, and read in Kent's railing speech, "Deuce, if I had you upon Sarum Plain, I'd drive ye cackling home to Camelot." The words were quite clear to me. Sarum Plain, Salisbury Plain, Camelot, Winchester, just 20 miles away. And I felt that with the help of Jack's geese, creatures with perhaps an antiquity in the droveway lands that Jack would not have guessed, I had arrived at an understanding of something in King Lear which, according to the editor of the text I read, commentators had found obscure. The solitude of the walk, the emptiness of that stretch of the downs, enabled me to surrender to my way of looking, to indulge my linguistic or historical fantasies, and enabled me, at the same time, to shed the nerves of being a stranger in England. Accident, the shape of the fields, perhaps, the alignment of paths and modern roads, the needs of the military, had isolated this little region, and I had this historical part of England to myself when I went walking. Daily I walked in the wide grassy way between the flint slopes, past chalk valleys rubbled white and looking sometimes like a Himalayan valley strewn in midsummer with old, gritted snow. Daily I saw the mounds that had been raised so many centuries before. The number of these mounds, they lay all around. From a certain height they were outlined against the sky and looked like pimples on the land. In the beginning I liked to tramp over the mounds that were more or less on my walk. The grass on these mounds was coarse. It was long-bladed, pale in color, and grew in ankle-turning tufts or clumps. The trees, where they existed, were wind-beaten and stunted. I picked my way up and down and around each mound. I wanted in those early days to leave no accessible mound unlooked at, feeling that if I looked hard enough and long enough I might arrive, not at an understanding of the religious mystery, but at an appreciation of the labor. Daily I walked in the wide grassy way, perhaps in the old days a processional way. Daily I climbed up from the bottom of the valley to the crest of the way in the view, the stone circles directly ahead, down below, but still far away, gray against green, and sometimes lit up by the sun. Going up the grassy way, and though willing to admit that the true processional path might have been elsewhere, I never ceased to imagine myself a man of those bygone times, climbing up to have this confirmation that all was well with the world. There was a main road on either side of the henge. On those two roads trucks and vans and cars were like toys. At the foot of the henge there was the tourist crowd, not very noticeable, not as noticeable as one might imagine from the fairground atmosphere around the stones when you actually went to them. The tourist crowd, from this distance, was noticeable only because of the red dress or coat that some of the women wore. That color red among the visitors to Stonehenge was something that I never failed to see, always someone in red, among the little figures. And in spite of that crowd, and the highways, and the artillery ranges, with their fluorescent or semi-luminous targets, my sense of antiquity, my feeling for the age of the earth and the oldness of man's possession of it, was always with me. A vast sacred burial ground, bounded by the sky. Of what activity those barrows and tumuli spoke, what numbers, what organization, what busyness in these now virtually empty downs. That sense of antiquity gave another scale to the activities around one. But at the same time, from this height, and with that wide view, there was a feeling of continuity. So the idea of antiquity, at once diminishing and ennobling the current activities of men, as well as the ideas of literature, enveloped this world which, surrounded by highways and army barracks though it was, and with the very clouds in the sky sometimes seeded by the vapor trails of busy military airplanes, came to me as a lucky find of the solitude in which on many afternoons I found myself. Lark Hill was the name of the Army Artillery School. In my first or second year there was something like a fair or open day there when, in the presence of the families of the soldiers, guns were fired off. But the Lark Hill I looked for on my walk was the hill with ancient barrows where literally larks bred, and behaved like the larks of poetry. And drowned in yonder living blue the lark becomes a sightless song. It was true, the birds rose and rose, in almost vertical flight. I suppose I had heard larks before. But these were the first larks I noticed, the first I watched and listened to. They were another lucky find of my solitude, another unexpected gift. And that became my mood. When I grew to see the wild roses and hawthorn on my walk, I didn't see the windbreak they grew beside as a sign of the big landowners who had left their mark on the solitude, had preserved it, had planted the woods in certain places, in imitation, it was said, of the positions at the Battle of Trafalgar. Or was it Waterloo? I didn't think of the landowners. My mood was purer. I thought of these single-petaled roses and sweet-smelling blossoms at the side of the road as wild and natural growths. One autumn day, the days shortening, filling me with thoughts of winter pleasures, fires and evening lights and books, one autumn day I felt something like a craving to read of Winter and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a poem I had read more than 20 years before at Oxford as part of the Middle English course. The hips and the haws beside the windbreak, the red berries of this dead but warm time of year, made me want to read again about the winter journey in that old poem. And I read the poem on the bus back from Salisbury, where I had gone to buy it. So in tune with the landscape had I become, in that solitude, for the first time in England. Of literature and antiquity and the landscape Jack and his garden and his geese and cottage and his father-in-law seemed emanations. It was his father-in-law I noticed first. And it was his father-in-law I met first. I met him quite early on, while I was still exploring, and before I had settled on a regular daily route. I walked or picked my way down little-used lateral lanes on the hillsides, lanes deep in mud, or overgrown with tall grass, or overhung with trees. I walked in those early days along lanes or paths I was never to walk along again. And it was on one of those exploratory walks, on a lateral lane linking the steep rocky road beside the windbreak with the wider, flatter way, it was on one of those little-used, half-hidden lanes that I met the father-in-law. He was fantastically, absurdly bent, as though his back had been created for the carrying of loads. A strange croaking came out of him when he spoke to me. It was amazing that, speaking like that, he should attempt speech with a stranger. But more amazing were his eyes, the eyes of this bent man. They were bright and alive and mischievous. In his cadaverous face, of a curious color, a gray color, a swarthiness which made me think of gypsy origins, in his cadaverous face with a bristle, almost a down, of white on cheek and chin, these eyes were a wonder and a reassurance, that in spite of the accident that had permanently damaged his spine, the personality of the man remained sound. He croaked. Dogs? Dogs? That was what the croaking sounded like. He stopped, raised his head like a turtle. He croaked, he raised a finger of authority. He seemed to say, Dogs? Dogs? And it needed only an echoing word from me. Dogs? For him to subside, be again a bent old man minding his own business. His eyes dimmed, his head sank down. Dogs, he muttered, the word choking in his throat. Worry pheasants. Beside the lane, and in the shelter of trees, were hedge-high cages with pheasants. It was new to me to see that these apparently wild creatures were in fact reared a little like backyard chickens. As it was new to me to understand that the woods all around had been planted, and all the alternating roses and hawthorns beside the windbreak of beech and pine. In the hidden lane, a little impulse of authority, even bullying, was someone who was a stranger and, in terms of gypsiness, 20 times as swarthy. But it was the briefest impulse in the old man, and perhaps it was also a social impulse, a wish to exchange words with someone new, a wish to add one more human being to the tally of human beings he had encountered. He subsided, the brightness in his eyes went out, and I never heard him speak again. Our paths never really crossed. I saw him occasionally in the distance. Once I saw him actually with a load of wood on his bent back, Wordsworthian, the subject of a poem Wordsworth might have called The Fuel Gatherer. He walked very slowly, yet in that slowness, that deliberation, there was conviction. He had set himself a task he certainly intended to finish. There was something animal-like about his routine. Like a rat, he seemed to have a run. Though, apart from looking after the pheasants, which might not have been true, it wasn't clear to me what he did on the land. The droveway, the way along the floor of the ancient river valley, was very wide. When I first went walking, it was unfenced. In my first year, or the second, the wide way was narrowed. A barbed wire fence was put up. It ran down the middle of the way, where the way was long and straight, and those sturdy green fence posts, the thicker ones stoutly buttressed, and the taut lines of barbed wire made me feel, although the life of the valley was just beginning for me, that I was also in a way at the end of the thing I had come upon. How sad it was to lose that sense of width and space. It caused me pain. But already I had grown to live with the idea that things changed. Already I lived with the idea of decay. I had always lived with this idea. It was like my curse, the idea, which I had had even as a child in Trinidad, that I had come into a world past its peak. Already I lived with the idea of death, the idea, impossible for a young person to possess, to hold in his heart, that one's time on earth, one's life, was a short thing. These ideas, of a world in decay, a world subject to constant change, and of the shortness of human life, made many things bearable. Later, even older encroachments were revealed on the droveway. Looking down at Stonehenge one summer, from the Hill of Larks, I saw, from the change of color in the fields of growing corn beside the droveway, what must have been the ruts of old cart or coach wheels. Because this way had been the old coach or wagon road from Stonehenge to Salisbury, a road that because of mud needed to be much wider than a paved road. Now some of the width of that old road had been incorporated, a long time ago, into fields and was behind barbed wire fencing. This fencing in of a great ancient way, this claiming as private property an ancient wide riverbed, no doubt sacred to the ancient tribes, and at one end of the wide valley, beyond the beehives, the caravan, the old hayrick, and the ruined house with the big sycamores, at that end, below the thin grass on the western bank, there were the marks either of ancient furrows or fortifications. This emphasis on property should have made me think of the present, the great estates by which I was surrounded, the remnant of the estate on which I lived. I saw the farmer, or the farm manager making his rounds in a Land Rover. I saw the modern grain barn at the top of the hill. I saw the wind break up and down that hill and saw that it had been recently planted, with the pines growing faster than the beeches they were intended to protect, and already creating something like a strip of woodland, with a true woodland litter of fallen branches and dead wood. I saw the hand of man, but didn't sufficiently take it in, preferring to see what I wanted, the great geography of the plain here, with the downs and the old river valley, far from the course of the present, smaller river. I saw the antiquity. I saw the debris of the old farmyard. In this way of seeing at that time what I wanted to see, I was a little like Jack's father-in-law, who ignored the new fence that cut at many places into segments of his run across the droveway. He ignored the new gates, they were few, and stuck to his run, creating stiles and steps and padded passing places over and through the barbed wire, working in his old way, rolling blue plastic sacks around the barbed wire and then tying them with spiral after spiral of red blonde raffia or nylon. The odd zigzag of the old man's run was now revealed, as were its widest limits, from the pheasant cages on the muddy, shaded lane on the far side of the hill with the new barn, down that lane, across the droveway, and all the way up a scrub-bordered field to the old wood on the northern slope. On a field gate there, one day in my first summer, I saw a number of crows spread-eagled and rotting, some recent, some less so, some already reduced to feathery husks. It was strange to link this fierce act with the bent old man, who moved so slowly, but when his mischievous eyes came to mind, his swarthy white gypsy skin, his strong, sly face, the act fitted. A whole life, a whole enduring personality, was expressed in that run. And so strong were the reminders of the old man's presence, so much of his spirit appeared to hover over his run, over his stiles and steps and those oddly placed rolled-up plastic sacks, even those he had rolled up and tied long ago and were shredding now, plastic without its shine, blue turning to white. So much did all of this speak of the old man moving slowly back and forth on his own errands, that it was some time before it occurred to me that I had not seen him for a while. And then I understood that what I had been seeing for many weeks past, many months past, were his relics. He had died. There had been no one to record the fact publicly, to pass the news on. And long afterwards, on the fences growing older themselves, those plastic wraps or pads continued to bleach and shred away. Still with us, like the other debris at the bottom of the valley, the roofless walls of the ruined house, the antiquated farm machinery below the young silver birches, the other machinery and discarded timber and metal below the beech trees at the back of the old farm buildings, the metal bracket in the loading window of the superseded, crumbling barn. And it was a good while later that I got to know that the old man had lived and died in Jack's house, and that he was Jack's father-in-law. But before I got to know Jack, I got to know the farm manager. I suppose, because Jack lived in one of the agricultural cottages attached to the farm, that the farm manager was Jack's boss. I never thought of them in that relationship, though. I thought of them as separate people. The farm manager made his rounds in a Land Rover. He had a dog with him, sometimes on the seat beside him, sometimes looking out from the back. We met on the rocky lane that led up from the bottom of the valley, where the old farm buildings and cottages were, to the new barn at the top of the hill. This was the steepest climb of the walk, and I treated it as the exercise part. It came at the right point, near the end, and it was just long enough and taxing enough to make me feel the muscles of my legs and to set me breathing deeply. It was on this hill that the farm manager stopped one afternoon to speak a friendly word, humorously offering a lift, perhaps, for the last 50 yards. He was a middle-aged man, with glasses. The lane was narrow. I had on more than one afternoon had to stand aside to let him pass. I had at first seen just the Land Rover, the vehicle. Then I had seen the man inside, had become familiar with his features, and the contented rather than watchful look of the dog with him. I had assumed that he was the farmer, the owner or lessee of these well-kept acres, and I had accordingly given him a farmer's walk. When he got out of the Land Rover at the barn and walked in to see how the grain was drying out, or whatever it was he was going to check, I had endowed him with a special kind of authority, a special attitude to the land around us. But then I discovered, from the man himself, that he was not the landowner. And I had to revise my way of looking at him. He was only the farm manager, an employee. His inspection drives covered part of my walk. The lane beside the windbreak led down to the public road. In the sunken ground across this road was the cow or dairy section of the farm. Behind the cow sheds were the water meadows and, in the distance, the willows and other trees on the riverbank. At the side of the road, at the entrance to this farmyard, there was a wooden platform 3 or 4 feet high. On this platform milk churns were placed, for collection by the dairy van. After this, the public road went past a thatched, pink-walled cottage and some plainer houses of flint and brick. Then came the yews and beeches of the manor. This was where my walk ended, a wide entrance in the dark green gloom, and then the bright lawn in front of my cottage. This was the part of the public road which, when I had come out onto it after the first 4 days of rain, had set me a puzzle, whether to turn to the right or the left. Now, if the manager's Land Rover came from behind and passed me here, I knew where it was going. Past the yews, along the beech-hung road high above the river, and then down to the little settlement at river level where the white-walled thatched cottage was being done up, and where an asphalted lane, progressively more broken, led past a number of small houses, some with raised monograms, to the wide, unpaved droveway. My feeling for that wide, grassy way had grown. I saw it as the old bed of an ancient river, almost something from another geological age. I saw it as the way down which geese might have once been driven to Camelot Winchester from Salisbury Plain. I saw it as the old stagecoach road. But it was near there, the present encroaching all the time on something more than the past, encroaching on antiquity, sacred ground, that among the small houses I had not paid much attention to, in a small, neatly fenced plot with a paved drive and a low little bungalow and an extravagant, overplanted garden, full of tall flowers and dwarf conifers and tall ornamental clumps. It was there, on the paved drive, that I saw the Land Rover one day and on other days. This, then, was where the manager lived and where his inspection drives ended, a little bit of suburbia at the very edge of antiquity. Yet I had taken the house for granted. In the gradual shaping of the land around me, the neat house had taken longer to come out at me, to be noticed. The antiquity, so much vaguer, so much a matter of conjecture, had made its impression more easily. I was ready for it. Almost immediately, starting on his farm round, the manager would have driven down the deeply rutted droveway past the almost bare bank welted with ancient furrows. His thoughts no doubt of woods and fields and crops and cattle, seeing different things from those I saw, he would have driven down the straight length of the droveway now bisected by the barbed wire fence he had himself put up or caused to be put up, past the roofless stone house with the tall sycamores, the old hayrick shaped like a cottage and covered with black plastic sheeting, past the caravan in the shade of the scrub and trees on one side, and the 2 rows of hives incorporated now into the barbed wire enclosure on the other side, past the old farm buildings, with the new hay shed though, and the cottages, one of which was Jack's, past Jack's garden and goose ground, up to the new metal-walled barn. This was the manager's run, almost circular. It was also Jack's, and it was partly mine. I had seen Jack at work in his vegetable allotment, the plot beyond the cottage front gardens, at the beginning of the slope towards the farm's cultivated fields. I had noticed the odd elegance of his trimmed, pointed beard. And though, in his allotment, his personality was at once clearer than the personality of the other farm workers, whose personalities were at least half expressed by their tractors or their tractors' tasks, steadily, swath by swath, altering the color or texture of a vast field, Jack had at first been a figure in the landscape to me, no more. As no doubt I also was to him, a stranger, a walker, someone exercising an old public right-of-way in what was now private land. But after some time, after many weeks, when he felt perhaps that the effort wouldn't be wasted, he adopted me. And from a great distance, as soon as he saw me, he would boom out a greeting, which came over less as defined words than as a deliberate making of noise in the silence. I saw him more clearly when he worked in the garden at the front, or back, of his cottage, and most clearly of all when he worked in his wire-fenced bedding-out plot, turning over the soft, dark, much-sifted earth below the old hawthorn tree. That brought back very old memories to me, of Trinidad, of a small house my father had once built on a hill and a garden he had tried to get started in a patch of cleared bush, old memories of dark, wet, warm earth and green things growing, old instincts, old delights. And I had an immense feeling for Jack, for the strength and curious delicacy of his forking and sifting gesture, the harmony of hand and foot. I saw, too, as the months went by, his especial, exaggerated style with clothes, bare-backed in summer at the first hint of sun, muffled up as soon as the season turned. I grew to see his clothes as emblematic of the particular season, like something from a modern book of hours. And then one day he, like the farm manager in his Land Rover, stopped in his car on the steep hill from the farm buildings up beside the windbreak to the barn. Jack and the other cottagers had motor cars. Without cars they would not have been able to live easily in those cottages. The cottages were too far from the public road and many miles from shops. I believe that the postman called only once a week. I had heard the car and stood aside. It was what you had to do on this narrow farm road. If you wished to hide, you could stand in the windbreak itself, among the beeches and pines, in the shaded litter of fallen branches. It was from this stepping aside and watching them pass in their cars or tractors that I had got to know the farm workers. And they, after the solitude of their tractor cabs and the downs, were invariably ready for a wave and a smile. It was the limit of communication. There was really nothing to add to the wave, the smile, the human acknowledgement. So it now turned out with Jack, though this stopping in his own car, in his free time, was special. We looked at each other, examined each other, made noises rather than talked. I had always noticed his pointed beard. Seeing him from a distance, I had thought of this beard as part of a young man's dash. Seeing him digging, considering his height, the depth of his chest, the sturdiness of his legs, his upright, easy walk, I had thought of him as a young man. But I saw now that his beard was almost gray. He was in his late 40s, perhaps. His eyes were far away. It was his eyes, oddly obstreperous, oddly jumpy, that gave him away, that said he was after all a farm worker, that in another setting, in a more crowded or competitive place, he might have sunk. And the discovery was a little disconcerting, because, after I had got rid of the idea that he was a remnant of an old peasantry, I had found in that beard of his, and in his bearing, his upright, easy, elegant walk, the attributes of a man with a high idea of himself, a man who had out of principle turned away from other styles of life. We had had little to say, but a neighborliness had been established between us, and it continued to be expressed in his shout from afar. His garden taught me about the seasons, and I got to know in a new way things I must have seen many times before. I saw the blossom come on his well-pruned apple trees, got to know the color of the blossom, carried it in my mind, and was able therefore always to recall it, attached it to a particular time of year, saw the small fruit form, hang green, grow with the rest of the garden, and then turn color. I saw the fertility that at first did not seem possible in this chalky, flinty soil which in the summer could show white. In England I was not a gardener, and had not taken much interest in the little front gardens I had seen, and saw even now, from the bus into Salisbury. Looking at those gardens, I saw only colors, and was barely able visually to disentangle one plant from another. But afternoon by afternoon I considered Jack's garden, noticing his labor, and looking to see what his labor brought forth. I saw with the eyes of pleasure. But knowledge came slowly to me. It was not like the almost instinctive knowledge that had come to me as a child of the plants and flowers of Trinidad. It was like learning a second language. If I knew then what I know now, I would be able to reconstruct the seasons of Jack's garden or gardens. But I can remember only simple things like the bulbs of spring, the planting out of annuals like marigolds and petunias, the delphiniums and lupins of high summer, and flowers like the gladiolus which, to my delight, flourished in both the climate of England and the tropical climate of Trinidad. There were also the roses trained about tall, stout poles, with hundreds of blooms, and then, on those small apple trees, always pruned down, the wonder of the fruits swelling in the autumn, touched in that cool season with the warmest tints, and looking like the apple trees in a children's book or a schoolbook seen long ago. At the back of his cottage, the back being where the true front now was, the true entrance from the drove-way, there was a greenhouse. It looked like the greenhouses advertised in newspapers and magazines, and might have been bought by mail order. In this greenhouse, resting on a concrete base, oddly level and new and formal in the open littered ground between the old farmyard and the cottages, littered with cottagers' stuff as well as with the farm debris of years, and not far from the ruined old pens where sick cattle and calves were sometimes kept, trampling their own dung into moss-covered black earth, in this greenhouse with its straight lines, new wood, and clear glass, Jack grew the over-cultivated flowers and plants of the English greenhouse, the extraordinary fuchsias, for example, which were thought to be so pretty. So many things to look after. So many different things to grow at different times. Jack, it seemed, was looking for labor, looking for tasks, seeking to keep himself busy. And then it came to me that more than busyness, the filling of the day, was involved, and more than money, the extra money Jack might have made from selling his plants and vegetables. It seemed that in that patch of ground, amid the derelict buildings of a superseded kind of farming, fewer and less efficient machines, many more human hands available in this county of Wiltshire, known in the last century for the poverty of its farm laborers, Jack had found fulfillment. My wonder at the satisfactions of his life, a man in his own setting, as I thought, to me an especially happy condition, a man in tune with the seasons in his landscape. My wonder turned to envy one Sunday afternoon, when going out after lunch for my walk, I saw Jack's little car bumping about towards his cottage along the wide, rutted drove-way, and not doing the more usual thing of coming down the paved lane beside the windbreak. He had been to the pub. His face was inflamed. His shout when he saw me, and he seemed to lean out of the car window, was wonderfully hearty. Sunday! But why had he chosen to turn off at the grassy drove-way? Why hadn't he driven the half a mile or so further up to the more usual way in, easier for his car, the paved, though broken, lane that led straight up the hill to the new barn and then directly down to the cottage. Was it drunkenness? Was it his wish to bang about the driveway? Or was it his fear of the narrow road winding on a ledge above the sharp drop down to the river, with 2 or 3 blind corners? It was probably in his own mind his Sunday drive, the climax of the extended pub hour. The pleasures of beer on a Sunday. They were like the pleasures of work in his garden as a free man. Here was an unchanging world, so it would have seemed to the stranger. So it seemed to me when I first became aware of it, the country life, the slow movement of time, the dead life, the private life, the life lived in houses closed one to the other. But that idea of an unchanging life was wrong. Change was constant. People died, people grew old, people changed houses, houses came up for sale. That was one kind of change. My own presence in the valley, in the cottage of the manor, was an aspect of another kind of change. The barbed wire fence down the straight stretch of the driveway, that also was change. Everyone was aging, everything was being renewed or discarded. Not long after I got to know the manager's run, change began to come to it. The elderly couple in the thatched cottage on the public road, a cottage with a rich rose hedge, left. In their place came strangers, a whole family. Town people, I heard. The man had come to work on the farm as cowman or dairyman. Dairymen, their labor constant and unchanging, seeing a large number of cows through the milking machines twice a day, every day, were the most temperamental of farm workers. Some of them were even itinerants, wanderers. The new dairyman was an ugly man. His wife was also ugly. And there was a pathos about their ugliness. Ugliness had come to ugliness for mutual support, but there had been little comfort as a result. It was odd about change. There were so few houses in the 2 settlements that made up the village or hamlet. But because the road was not a place where people walked, because lives were lived so much in houses, because people did their shopping in the towns round about, Salisbury, Amesbury, Wilton, and there was no common or meeting place, and because there was no fixed community, it took time for change, great though it might be, to be noticed. The tall beeches, the oaks and chestnuts, the bends and shadows in the narrow road, the blind curves, the very things that made for country beauty also made for something like secrecy. It was this feeling, of being private and unobserved, that had made me, at the time of my own arrival, give false replies to questions from people I later knew to be farm workers or council workers. They had been friendly, interested. They wanted to know in which house I was staying. I lied. I made up a house. It didn't occur to me that they would know all the houses. I had barely got to know the elderly couple who had lived in the thatched cottage. I knew their cottage better. It had struck me as being picturesque. It was narrow and pink-walled. The thatch was kept in place by wire netting. Part of the thatch below the dormer window was brilliant green with moss, and on the ridge of the roof there was the wire-framed figure of a reed or straw pheasant, something I saw, originally a bit of Thatcher's fantasy, now a more general decorative feature, on many houses in the locality. With its privet and rose hedge, hundreds of small pink roses, the pink cottage had looked the very pattern of a country cottage. It was only now, with the departure of the old couple, that I understood that the country cottage effect of their house, and especially of their hedge and garden, had been their work, their taste, the result of their constant attentions. Very soon now, within months, the garden became ragged. The privet kept its tightness, but the rose hedge, unpruned and untrained, became wild and straggly. The story about the new family in the cottage, picked up from certain things said by Bray, the car hire man, their near neighbor, from other things said by the people who looked after the manor, and from words occasionally spoken on the afternoon shopping bus that went to Salisbury. The story was that the new dairyman and his family had had a rough time in a town somewhere, and that they had been saved by coming to the valley. The man was tall, young, with a long head, thin-haired, with a heaviness rather than a coarseness about his features. He had the face of a man who had endured abuse. But it was still a young face. His wife looked aged. Whatever it was the family had endured had marked her face. She could have passed as his mother. Where his face and head were long, she was square-faced, and her square face was crushed, wrinkled. She wore rimless glasses, an unexpected attempt at style. She was withdrawn. In time, smiles came to her husband's face. But I never saw her smile. What terrors must there have been in the town for them? How could people like these, without words to put to their emotions and passions, manage? They could, at best, only suffer dumbly. Their pains and humiliations would work themselves out in their characters alone, like evil spirits possessing a body, so that the body itself might appear innocent of what it did. This couple had 2 children, boys. The elder had something of his father's abused, put upon look, but there was about him an added touch of violence, of mischief, of unconscious wickedness. The younger boy was more like his mother. Though he was very small and neat in his schoolboy's gray flannel suit, he already had something of his mother's distant, withdrawn air. There was a bus that, leaving Salisbury in the early afternoon, served as a school bus for the little towns and villages just to the north. It picked up young children from the infant schools in one direction, and then on the way back it picked up bigger children from the secondary schools. This bus picked up both the dairymen's boys. I sometimes used the bus myself. Life in the valley being what it was, this gave me my closest look at the boys. And I began to feel that though the boys might have been saved by the valley, as people said, the ways of the town pressed on them still. The older children, though noisy, were generally well-mannered. It was their custom when the bus was full to stand and offer their seat to an adult. Rebellion with them sometimes took the modest form of delaying the gesture. The dairyman's elder son added another tone or mood to the school bus. Noisiness became rowdiness, and one day I saw him not only refusing to stand but also continuing to keep his feet on the seat beside him. He was embarrassed when I got on the bus. I was a neighbor, I knew his house and his parents. But he was also among his friends, and he couldn't let himself down. The bus dropped us both off in the shade of the great manor yews, near his house and mine. I said, "Peter." He stood to attention, like a cadet or a boy in a reformatory, threw back his head, and said, "Sir," as though expecting at the very least a slap, and at the same time not truly intending apology or respect. In that reaction, which made me nervous, I felt I had a glimpse of his past, and saw his need for aggression, his only form of self-assertion. I didn't know how to go on with him. I didn't particularly want to. I didn't say any more. He was odd man out on the bus, and like an intruder in the village. In fact, there were no other boys of his age around. People with growing families tended to move out. And though there were a number of young children, the dairyman's younger boy was also a little strange. Among the children from the infant schools on its route, the school bus picked up 2 or 3 near idiots. The dairyman's younger son, delicate and small, attached himself to one of these, a fat little boy, thick-featured, with a heavy, round head, a boy dressed in startling colors, bright red sometimes, bright yellow at other times, with pale blonde eyelashes and eyebrows that, oddly, suggested someone dim-sighted. This fat child was restless on the bus. He moved from seat to seat and, as though knowing that the constrictions of school were over, spoke insults casually through his thick wet lips at people on the bus, innocently spoke obscenities, in a tone of voice which permitted one to hear the older person from whom the words had been picked up. This was the friend of the dairyman's younger son. They were being saved by the job, their life in the valley that so many people wished to live in. But they stood out. And they were wrecking the garden of the pretty pink cottage they had taken over. It wasn't, as with Peter on the bus, a wish to offend. It was ignorance, not knowing, not beginning to imagine that the way they lived at home could be of interest to anyone. Part of their new freedom was the country secrecy, the freedom from observation, which, like me, at the beginning, they thought they had found in the dark empty road and the big empty fields. Out of that freedom, that new, ignorant pleasure in country life, some curious gypsy or horse-dealing instinct came to the dairyman. He bought a run-down white horse and kept it in a small field beside the public road. The animal was a wretched creature, and was made more wretched now by its solitude. It had soon cropped the grass of its small field right down. It was spiritless, idle. People on the bus commented on its state. And then something else occurred to make the dairyman talked about. His cows broke loose one evening. They wandered about the road, trampled over fields, a few gardens, and the lawn of the manor, in front of my cottage. And then one day, again in front of my cottage, down the path on the other side of the lawn, the dairyman led a hairy brown and white pony, thick-legged and thick-necked, to the paddock at the back. And there one afternoon, after school time, the dairyman and his son Peter gelded and mutilated the pony, and then they led the bleeding animal back past the windows of my cottage to the white wide gate, past the churchyard, to the dark lane below the yews, and then to the public road. Did they know what they were doing? Had they been trained? Or had they just been told that the gelding was something they should do? I never actually heard, but I believe the pony died. It was the cruelty of the man who looked after animals. Not absolute cruelty, more a casualness, the attitude of a man who looked after lesser, dependent creatures, superintending the entire cycle of their lives, capable of tenderness, yet living easily with the knowledge that though a cow might have produced so many calves and given so much milk, it would one day have to be dispatched to the slaughterhouse in a covered trailer. Cows and grass and trees, pretty country views, they existed all around me. Though I hadn't truly seen those views before or been in their midst, I felt I had always known them. On my afternoon walk on the downs there was sometimes a view on one particular slope of black and white cows against the sky. This was like the design on the condensed milk label I knew as a child in Trinidad, where cows as handsome as those were not to be seen, where there was very little fresh milk and most people used imported condensed milk or powdered milk. Now, not far from that view, there was this intimate act of cruelty. The memory of that mutilated, bleeding pony, still with the bad-tempered toss of its head and mane, being led to the white gate below the yews by the two big-headed men, father and son, was with me for some time. They had been saved, that town family. Was it Bristol they had come from? Or Swindon? How fearful those towns seemed to working people here. And fearful to me, too, though for different reasons. But their life in the country was not as secret or unobserved as they might have thought. They were more judged now than they had perhaps been in the town. And the feeling began to grow. I heard comments on the bus, and more comments were reported to me by the couple who looked after the manor, that it was time for them, so noticeable, causing so many kinds of offense, to leave. From Bray, the car hire man, their near neighbor, who liked being man out a little himself, I heard the only thing in their favor. Bray came one evening to rescue a starling that had got into the loft of my cottage and couldn't get out again. Bray did the job easily. Then, talking of his neighbors, he said of the dairyman's elder boy, "He's very good with birds, you know." Bray was holding both his hands around the frightened, glossy, blue-black bird he had brought down, holding both heavy hands together so that the bird rested on his broad fingers and the bird's head protruded from the circle formed by his index fingers and thumbs. The two hands could have crushed the bird with one easy gesture, but only Bray's thumbs moved, stroking the bird's head, slowly, one thumb after the other, until the bird appeared to be looking about itself again. Bray, though he had turned the ground in front of his house into a motor mechanic's yard, was a countryman. His talk about birds and their habits seemed to come from his childhood, almost from another age. And I wondered how an understanding of birds, like Bray's understanding, could have come to the dairyman's son. In place of the white and red-brown pony in the paddock there came a very tall, elegant horse. It was a famous old racehorse, I heard. I don't think its appearance in the paddock had anything to do with the dairyman. Some local landowner, perhaps even the man who, indirectly, was going to get rid of the dairyman, might have been responsible. The name of the animal and his great fame I didn't know. Nor, from simply looking at him, could I tell his great age. But he was very old. He had only a few months or weeks to live. He had come to the valley to die. He still looked muscular and glossy to me. He was like certain sportsmen or athletes who, even in age, when strength and agility have gone, retain something of the elegance of the body they trained for so long. And hearing about the fame of this animal, his triumphs and great record, I found myself indulging in anthropomorphic questions when I considered him in the paddock. Did he know who he was? Did he know where he was? Did he mind? Did he miss the crowds? I went one day to the very edge of the manor grounds to look at the horse, past the tall grass, the big spread of stacked up, wet beech leaves slowly turning to compost, the mossed over, mildewed apple trees, with a glimpse of the rest of the forested orchard to one side. The old racehorse turned its head towards me in a curious way. And then I saw, with pain and nervousness, that it was blind in its left eye. As I approached, it had had to swivel its head to look at me with its bright and trusting right eye, still to me not at all like an old eye. How tall he was! And it was only now, close to it, that I saw that its coat had been glossier and more even, that its muscles had been firmer. This animal had grown used to the attentions and kindness of men. It was restful to be close to it. So much more painful, then, to see the blind side of its head. The eye had been taken out altogether, and skin had grown over the socket. The skin there was quite whole, so that on the blind side the horse's head was like sculpture. I had an oblique view from my cottage sitting room of the paddock and the water meadows beyond. The water meadows were now the cows' grazing area, and twice a day the cows came out there after milking, swaying heavily in the wet fields, and sometimes preferring to walk in the ditches. Twice or 4 times a day, then, calling his cows in or sending them out, the dairyman saw the old horse. The sight of the horse, noble, famous, partly blind, standing alone, had its effect on him. And he, who had mangled a spirited young pony in the same paddock, he on whom the axe was about to fall, the town from which he had been rescued was the place to which he and his family would soon have to go back. He, whose own life was so full of torment, worked himself up into a state about the abandoned horse, as he saw it, so close to death. He came to my cottage one Sunday evening. He had never come to the cottage before. Some friends had called, he said, and they had talked about the horse and the tragedy of its last days. So famous, so pampered, earner once of so much money, and now alone in a small, roughly fenced paddock, waiting for death, without crowds or acclaim. It wasn't fair, the dairyman said. It was terrible for him, seeing that every day. Who were these friends he had been talking to? What kind of people? Were they his wife's friends as well? Did they come from that town where things had gone wrong for the dairyman? Did the friends know that their own friend was about to get the sack, and had they come to commiserate? Or had they just come for the day in the country? What the dairyman had come to ask, almost in tears at the end of this Sunday afternoon with his friends, was that I should help to get a book off the ground about the old racehorse, to do justice to the old animal. I gave him no encouragement. His sentimentality frightened me. It was the sentimentality of a man who could give himself the best of reasons for doing strange things. In a short time the horse ceased to be in the paddock. It had died. Like so many deaths here, in this small village, like so many big events, it seemed to happen off stage. The winter turned unexpectedly mild. The sun came out, a kind of blossom came out. When I went for my walk I met the dairyman coming down the hill from the barn. He smiled broadly. He had forgotten about the horse. He turned around and waved at the hillside. He said, "May in February." He didn't mean the month of May, he meant May, the blossom of the hawthorn. It was the last expression of delight in country things I heard from him. There was an element of acting about it. He was like a man living up to a role that had been given him. And he was wrong. What had come out at the top of the hill was not the hawthorn, but the blackthorn. At the top of the hill, on a long lateral lane, broken by the paved farm road and the windbreak, there was a line of these trees. It was on a section of this lane that in my earliest days I had met Jack's father-in-law and exchanged the only words I had ever exchanged with him. The morning sun struck full on these trees, on the side you saw as you came up the hill from the public road. And in the sudden mildness the trees had turned white with blossom above the black winter mud and the puddles created by the tractor wheels. The dairyman and his family left, unnoticed, quietly. 1 week they were there, noticeable, in possession of the house and garden. The next week the house felt empty, became more purely a house again, and seemed to be touched again with something of its country cottage character. And there were bigger changes. The farm manager retired. He was no longer to be seen making his rounds with his dog in the Land Rover. The farm passed into new hands. And soon there was new activity, more tractors, more farm machinery, a greater busyness. The winter that seemed to have retreated so early that year returned. At last the true spring came. It touched Jack's garden. But, though all around was activity, on down and Droway and Field Lane, with tractors of new design and brighter colors, there was no human celebration in Jack's plots of ground, nothing of the rituals I had grown to expect. The mud-spattered, autumn-clipped hedge burst into life, and the apple trees and the shrubs and the rose bushes, but there was no controlling hand now. No cutting back and tying up, no weeding, nothing done in the greenhouse. No work on the vegetable plot, scattered growths of green there, stray roots and seeds. No turning over of the earth in the bedding out plot below the old hawthorn tree. Smoke rose from the chimney of Jack's cottage while his garden ran wild. Only the geese and ducks continued to be looked after. And all around was activity and change. The pink cottage had another couple, young people, in their 20s. The man did not work in the dairy. He was a more general kind of farm worker, and he was like the other workers the new management had brought in. They were young people, these new farm workers, educated up to a point, some of them perhaps with diplomas. They dressed with care, clothes, the new styles in clothes, were important to them. They were not particularly friendly. They might have been reflecting the seriousness and modernity of the new management, or they might have been anxious to make the point that, though they did farm workers' jobs, they were not exactly that kind of person. The man in the pink cottage had a new or newish car. On fine afternoons his wife sunbathed in the ruined garden, seemingly careless of showing her breasts. She was a short woman with heavy thighs. The contemporary fashion she followed didn't flatter her figure. They made her look heavy, badly proportioned, a little absurd. But one day I saw how the long dresses of an earlier era, with high, narrow waists and full hips, might have been absolutely right for her, would have made her voluptuous. And I felt that this was how she saw herself, immensely desirable, and that this sunbathing in the wreck of the garden, this care of what had at first seemed to me a slack, heavy body, was something she might have thought she owed to her beauty. The new car, her husband's careful clothes, these were further tributes. New people, young people as well, took over the other two cottages in Jack's Row at the bottom of the valley. New brooms down there, in both cottages. They swept clean. They dug up what had been left behind in both gardens, leveled the ground and planted grass. Jack's garden was wild. I saw Jack's wife outside the cottage one day. She said, talking of her new neighbors but making no gestures that might have betrayed her. "Have you seen? All lawn, my dear." The turn of speech, the irony, was a surprise. I had never thought Jack's wife capable of such things, but then I had thought of her, and she seemed to have been content to be regarded as an appendage of Jack's. "And the horses?" she said. The people in the middle cottage had a horse. I said, "How's Jack?" "He's all right, you know. He's working again. There's a lot for him to do in the garden," she said. "You think so?" As though I had said something untrue. Why did she want to deny what was so obvious? We were standing outside the garden. Had I mentioned something she felt I shouldn't have mentioned? Was I putting a curse on the sick man? Because Jack was sick. Though she said he was working again, he was not well. And intermittently all that summer, for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, even on those sunny days which in previous years he would have celebrated by working bare-backed in his garden, the smoke rose from one of the chimneys of the cottage like a symbol of his sickness, like a sign of the cold he felt, the sick man in his room. While the new farm workers, young men with young wives, drove up and down the big fields in their new tractors, and went out in their new or newish cars after work. Jack's wife commented gently, ironically, on the changes. But she seemed more and more to accept that Jack's hold on his job, his cottage, and his garden was going, and that her own time there was coming to an end. His car stopped beside me one day. It was the first time I had seen him since the previous autumn. His face was waxen. I knew the word from books. But never till now, seeing what it described on a white face, had I truly understood the word. All the brown of Jack's face, all the sun to which he had exposed himself in his garden, had gone. His skin was white and smooth, and it seemed to have the texture and false color of waxen fruit. It was as though a bloom, as on a plum, covered the living skin. His beard was trimmed and neat. Yet even that had a waxen, even waxed quality. Not many words, quiet words of greeting, friendship, reassurance. His obstreperous eyes were quiet too. Wax. And the smoke came out of his cottage chimney in the autumn and in the winter, and then it stopped. The lane that led up the hill to the new barn and then down to the cottages and old farm buildings, the lane beside the windbreak of beech and pine and the subsidiary hedge of field rose and hawthorn, had grown rough and broken. You could easily have turned your ankle on it. The new farm management began to have that lane mended. Men and machines came one week, and a level black layer of mixed asphalt and gravel was quickly laid down, in a few days. The black color and the machine finish looked new and unnatural next to the tufted grass of the verges. But the surface that had been so quickly laid down was meant to last, as if in pledge of that. The yellow board of the road makers was set up on the public road, just before the lane, and one end of the board was cut into a directional arrow. I didn't like the change. I felt it threatened what I had found and what I had just begun to enter. I didn't like the new busyness, the new machines, the machine lopping of the hawthorn and wild rose which left them looking damaged. And I didn't want that new surface on the farm lane to hold. I looked for cracks and flaws in it, and hoped that the little abrasions and water erosions I noticed would spread and make it impossible, fantasy taking over from logic, for the machines to lay down a new asphalt mixture. Of course I knew my fantasy was fantasy, though the farm was set among ruins of many sorts, reminders of the impermanence of men's doings. There was another side to men's work. Men came back, men went on, men did and did again. How small the caravels were that crossed the Atlantic and intruded into the evenness of history on the other side. How few the men in those small vessels, how limited their means, how barely noticed. But they went back. They changed the world in that part forever. So though the new asphalt layer was crushed here and there into dips by the tractor wheels, and though the rain, running down the hill, sought out every weakness and crack in the dips and dug out minute bits of asphalt from between small stones and then dug more deeply into the loosened surface, and the irregular edge of the surface was undermined by water running down in little channels, miniatures of the larger channels of which our valley was a relic. Between the hard black crust and the soft, grass-covered earth, though there were these things that made me feel that the lane might be reduced again to the rocky, uneven condition in which I had first found it, yet the lane was made good, and then made good again, and withstood the winter, which came fiercely that year. There was a blizzard on Christmas Day, with the wind blowing from the northwest. I found, when I went out in the early afternoon, that the snow had been blown into a drift in the windbreak. A bank of snow, then, beside the lane, and in the lee of every tree trunk, every sturdy twig, every obstacle, there was a sharp ridge that indicated the direction of the wind. The shape and texture of this snow drift reminded me of a climate quite different, of a Trinidad beach where shallow streams, fresh water mingled with salt, salt predominating or lessening according to the tides, ran from tropical woodland to the sea. These streams rose and subsided with the tide. Water flowed now from the sea to the pools of the woodland river, now in the other direction. At every low tide the streams cut fresh channels in the freshly laid sand, created fresh sand cliffs, which then, when the tide began to rise again, fell neatly, segment by clean segment, into the rippled current, a geography lesson in miniature. To me as a child these streams always brought to mind the beginning of the world before men, before the settlement. Romance and ignorance. For though there were no longer aboriginal people on the island, they had been there for millennia. So the texture and shapes and patterns of the snow here on the down in the windbreak and in its lee created, in small, the geography of great countries. Like the little rivulets that ran between the steep grass verge and the new asphalt crust of the lane. And this geography in miniature was set, as I thought, or as I liked to think, in a vaster geography. The valley of the droveway between the smooth low hills spoke of vast rivers hundreds of yards across, flowing here in some age now unimaginably remote, a geography whose scale denied the presence of men. There would have been a brimming river or flow all the way from Stonehenge, and the plain beyond, to Jack's cottage, and then along the droveway with the beehives and the caravan and stone shell of a house and farm manager's bungalow and suburban-style garden. There would have been a river all there, a flat gray flow, debouching into or filling the valley of the present river, a remnant, small-scale, human, beside which I sometimes walked and where people now fished for trout, released by keepers. In that vast geography created by the miniature landscape, and the fantasy of the droveway as river channel, there was no room for men. That vision was a vision of the world before men. Beyond the brow of the hill the wind was keen. Shelter was no longer provided by the hill or the windbreak. A livid gray sky, a gray but warm dirtiness, hung over the great plain, where the barrows were like pimples, the stones circles lost in the snow, blurring the view at the edges, no sight of the colored artillery targets. At the bottom of the hill, among the farm buildings, made monumental by the snowfall, was the dead cottage of Jack, snow lying on the ground about it, the droveway there normally so muddy and black, like a great clean thing, like a remaking of the world. The snow made for hard walking. But weather like this in this usually mild valley revived in me a wish for extremes, though it was the cold and the damp and the wet that had carried away Jack. His damaged lungs, in that damp valley bottom, had denied him warmth even in the summer. Something else, of course, if there had been no cold or damp, would have carried him away. On my early walks, after having my fill of the henge and the barrows, I had looked for hares on one slope. Then, on another hill, at another season I had looked for larks, trying to keep them in sight as they rose and rose, lift upon lift, and watching for them as they dropped down. Now I looked for deer. A family of 3 had appeared in the valley, coming from no one knew where, and surviving in our well-tilled, well-grazed valley, dangerous over large tracts with military gunfire, crossed at many places by busy highways, surviving among us no one knew how. They, the deer, had their run too. And it was in the hope of seeing them, in addition to my excitement at the snow and the wind, that I tramped round the farm buildings and up the droveway to the point from which there was a view of the wood and the untilled open slope where the deer sometimes grazed. And unbelievably, my Christmas reward, they were there, in the snow. Usually, against the wood, the deer were hard to see. Lower down, against the chalky green and brown of the bare slope, they were reddish-brown, warm, but they had to be looked for. Now, like the rabbits of my very first week, coming out to feed on the lawn in front of my cottage, the deer were dirty-looking, gray, dark against the snow, easy marks for anyone who wished to knock them off. I longed for those deer to survive. And they did. Towards the end of the winter I discovered one in the wilderness at the back of my cottage, in the marshland beside the river. He was a young deer and I caught sight of him one morning, all eyes, among the beaten-down brown reeds. And there for many mornings in succession I saw him. I stood on the rotting bridge over the Black Creek and looked. The secret, then, to see him, to keep him where he was to hold his eyes and to be still oneself. As long as you looked, he looked. As soon as you moved or made a gesture he was away, running at first through the reeds and tall grass and then giving the lovely leap that could take him clear over fences and hedges. The spring came. The new surface of the lane up the hill held. The new life of the farm continued. And for the second year running Jack's cottage and garden were apart from the activity. His death, his funeral, like the death and funeral of his father-in-law some years before, seemed to have happened secretly, one of the effects of the country life, the dark road, the scattered houses, the big views. His vegetable plot, overrun with weeds, was barely noticeable. His fruit and flower garden grew more wild, the hedge and the rose bushes growing out. His greenhouse at the back, really the front, became empty. So much that had looked traditional, natural, emanations of the landscape, things that country people did, the planting out of annuals, the tending of the geese, the clipping of the hedge, the pruning of the fruit trees, now turned out not to have been traditional or instinctive after all, but to have been part of Jack's way. When he wasn't there to do these things, they weren't done. There was only a ruin. The new people in the other cottages didn't do what he had done. They seemed to have little regard for their bit of cottage land. Or they saw it differently, or they had another idea of their lives. The first year of Jack's illness Jack's wife had pretended that nothing had changed, that Jack's garden was still a garden. Now she didn't pretend. She was making ready to leave. And she was doing so in a matter-of-fact way. As though, after all, in spite of appearances, in spite of the antique ways of her father, in spite of Jack, little had been invested by her in that cottage, the life attached to it, and those years of the garden. She now had no connection with the farm or the land. The local council was going to find a house or flat for her on a housing estate in the valley or in one of the nearby towns, Amesbury, Salisbury, Shrewton, Great Wishford, or elsewhere. She would meet more people, she would be nearer the shops. She was looking forward to the move. The traditional life, at the bottom of the valley, in the mud and damp around the farm, far from people, where you were shut up for the evening if you didn't have a car, the traditional life hadn't been to her taste. Still, she thought that Jack had had a good life. She said, "On the Christmas Eve he got up and went to the pub, you know. He knew he was going to die, and he knew it was his last chance." She spoke quite casually, giving me this news, now more than a year old. She was just making conversation. She said, he wanted to be with his friends for the last time. To be with his friends, to enjoy the last drink, to have the final sweetness of life as he knew it. What an effort it would have taken! To have those blocks of ice for lungs, to be incapable of getting warm, to be fatigued and faint, to want nothing more than to lie down and close one's eyes and sail away into the fantasies that were claiming one. And yet he had roused himself and found the energy to dress and had driven to the pub for the holiday, before his death. Did he drive along the lane up and down the hill beside the windbreak? Or did he, because it required less judgment, drive along the wide, rutted droveway? That way, along the droveway, would have been more likely to get him to the pub and back. But it would have shaken him up dreadfully, as I had seen him, in another mood, shaken up one spring or summer Sunday afternoon, when his shout had been touched with beer. That final trip to the pub served no cause except that of life, yet he made it appear an act of heroism, poetical. Across the lawn from my cottage there was a small old flint building. It was covered with ivy, and the ivy was so thick and firm that pigeons roost in it. The building was square in plan and had a pyramidal roof. This roof appeared to be open at the apex, and above that, on 4 stilts, was a second, miniature roof of the same pyramidal shape. I was told that the building had been a granary or storehouse and that it was some centuries old. It was not used now. I never saw anyone go into it. It was preserved for its beauty and as something from the past. Not far from it, and still on the far side of the lawn, was a building that pretended to be a rough old farmhouse. Its walls were made up of bits of brick and stone and flint, the mixture suggesting rubble, peasant pickings. It was about 50 years old and had been put up as one of the ancillary buildings of the manor, a fives court or squash court, but built in this picturesque way to suit the setting. Perhaps it had been used as a squash court for some time. But, its front door, permanently closed, its corrugated iron roof sagging in places, some of the glass panes of its windows fallen out, it had no function now, had had none for many years. Like the boathouse on the riverbank, like the round, 2-story children's house with the conical thatched roof and the overgrown orchard. The life of the manor had altered, the organization had shrunk. Needs that had once ramified as if to match the resources and organization of the big house had not been permanent. The manor too had its ruins. Between granary and mock farmhouse, and beyond the manor wall, was the church. To me in the beginning a church was a church, something built in a particular way, with windows of a particular shape, ideas given me by the Victorian Gothic churches I had seen in Trinidad. But I had that village church before my eyes every day, and quite soon, this new world shaping itself about me in my lucky solitude, I saw that the church was restored and architecturally was as artificial as the farmhouse. Once that was seen, it was seen. The church radiated its own mood, the mood of its Victorian Edwardian restorers. I saw the church not as church, but as part of the wealth and security of Victorian Edwardian times. It was like the manor to which my cottage was attached, like many of the other big houses around. The church stood on a premedieval site, that was what was said. But little about the church as it now was had come down from that time. Not a piece of flint, not a slab of dressed stone that framed the Gothic windows. And perhaps not even the faith was old. Just as it was hard to imagine the lives and religious impulses of the people who had with immense labor turned this plain into a burial ground and preserved its sanctity for centuries, so it was hard, though one stood on the very ground and was exposed to the same weather, but not now the same dawns or sunsets, always the vapor trails of aircraft, to enter into the spirit, the terrors and the need for redemption of the people who had worshipped 1,000 years before in the first Christian church on this site, that lay so close to me, just across the lawn and beyond the Play farmhouse. Play farmhouse, renovated church. Had that been a kind of play, too, the religion of the renovated church? Did the renovators share the old terrors? Or was this faith something quite different, something touched with the sense of history, the assurance of continuity, the sense of something owed to oneself? When you looked down on the plain from the viewing point in the windbreak on the hill, you could see Stonehenge to the west and the beginnings of the town of Amesbury to the east. The river Avon ran through Amesbury. There were chapels and abbeys here too, beside the river, wide and shallow at this point. Amesbury, now a military town, with little modern houses and shops and garages, was an old place. It was to a nunnery in Amesbury that Guinevere, Arthur's queen, the lover of Lancelot, had retired when the Round Table had vanished from Camelot, all of 20 miles away at Winchester. A sign on the road from Stonehenge, just before you entered Amesbury, celebrated the antiquity of the town, with a coat of arms and a date, 8979. The historical feeling that had caused that sign to be put up had also brought about the restoration of the chapels and abbeys of Amesbury, as well as of the church that lay across the lawn from my own cottage. History, like religion, or like an extension of religion, as an idea of one's own redemption and glory. Yet there was an uncelebrated darkness before the foundation of that town of Amesbury in AD 979, as recorded by the sign. More than 500 years before that, the Roman army had left Britain, and Stonehenge had been built and had fallen into ruin, and the vast burial ground had lost its sanctity, long before the Romans had come. So that history here, where there were so many ruins and restorations, seemed to be plateaus of light, with intervening troughs or disappearances into darkness. We lived still on one such plateau of historical light. Amesbury, founded AD 979. History, glory, religion as a wish to do the right thing by oneself. These ideas were still with some people in the valleys roundabout, though there had been some diminution in personal glory, and the new houses and gardens were like the small change of the great estates of the last century and the beginning of this century. These people, though they had come, many of them, from other places, still had the idea of being successors and inheritors. It was because of this idea of historical inheritance and succession that many new people in our valley went to the restored church. The church had been restored for people like them. It met their needs. In this they were different from Bray, the car hire man, who had lived all his life in the valley. Bray never went to the church, and was scornful of the motives of those who did. And the churchgoers were also different from Jack, who had lived the best part of his life in the cottage over the hill, and, while he was vigorous, had celebrated the seasons with rituals of his own. On Sundays Jack worked in the morning in his garden, and went to the pub at noon. In the afternoon he worked again in his garden. The church stood on an old site. I could believe that. Beyond the churchyard, and more or less hidden by the church itself, the old flint churchyard wall, and trees on the other side, were the sheds and buildings of the dairy. Did they also stand on an old site? I had no trouble believing that they did. Because the world, and places like this, is never absolutely new. There is always something that has gone before. Shrine or sacred place before church, farm before farm, on the site of an old ford set in a wood first. Walden, then Shaw, then Waldenshaw. A hamlet between the water meadows and the flinty downs. A hamlet, one of many, on the river highway. New to the valley, overwhelmed by the luck of the near solitude I had found in this historical part of England, the solitude that had done away with my stranger's nerves, I had seen everything as a kind of perfection, perfectly evolved. But I had hardly begun to look, the land and its life had hardly begun to shape itself about me, when things began to change. And I had fallen back on old ideas, ideas now not so much of decay, as of flux and the constancy of change, to fight the distress I felt at everything, a death, a fence, a departure, that undid or altered or threatened the perfection I had found. It could have been said that the perfection of the house in whose grounds I lived had been arrived at 40 or 50 years before, when the Edward Inn house was still fairly new, its family life fuller, when the ancillary buildings had a function and the garden was looked after. But in that perfection, occurring at a time of empire, there would have been no room for me. The builder of the house and the designer of the garden could not have imagined, with their world view, that at a later time someone like me would have been in the grounds, and that I would feel I was having the place, the cottage, the empty picturesque houses around the lawn, the grounds, the wild gardens, at its peak, living in a beauty that hadn't been planned for. I liked the decay, such as it was. It gave me no wish to prune or weed or set right or remake. It couldn't last, clearly. But while it lasted, it was perfection. To see the possibility, the certainty, of ruin, even at the moment of creation, it was my temperament. Those nerves had been given me as a child in Trinidad partly by our family's circumstances, the half-ruined or broken-down houses we lived in, our many moves, our general uncertainty. Possibly, too, this mode of feeling went deeper and was an ancestral inheritance, something that came with the history that had made me, not only India, with its ideas of a world outside men's control, but also the colonial plantations or estates of Trinidad, to which my impoverished Indian ancestors had been transported in the last century, estates of which this Wiltshire estate, where I now lived, had been the apotheosis. 50 years ago there would have been no room for me on the estate. Even now my presence was a little unlikely. But more than accident had brought me here. Or rather, in the series of accidents that had brought me to the manor cottage, with the view of the restored church, there was a clear historical line. The migration, within the British Empire, from India to Trinidad had given me the English language as my own, and a particular kind of education. This had partly seated my wish to be a writer in a particular mode, and had committed me to the literary career I had been following in England for 20 years. The history I carried with me, together with the self-awareness that had come with my education and ambition, had sent me into the world with a sense of glory dead, and in England had given me the rawest stranger's nerves. Now ironically, or aptly, living in the grounds of this shrunken estate, going out for my walks, those nerves were soothed, and in the wild garden and orchard beside the water meadows I found a physical beauty perfectly suited to my temperament and answering, besides, every good idea I could have had, as a child in Trinidad, of the physical aspect of England. The estate had been enormous, I was told. It had been created in part by the wealth of empire. But then bit by bit it had been alienated. The family in its many branches flourished in other places. Here in the valley there now lived only my landlord, elderly, a bachelor, with people to look after him. Certain physical disabilities had now been added to the malaise which had befallen him years before, a malaise of which I had no precise knowledge, but interpreted as something like aesthesia, the monk's torpor or disease of the Middle Ages, which was how his great security, his excessive worldly blessings, had taken him. The aesthesia had turned him into a recluse, accessible only to his intimate friends. So that on the manor itself, as on my walks on the down, I had a kind of solitude. I felt a great sympathy for my landlord. I felt I could understand his malaise. I saw it as the other side of my own. I did not think of my landlord as a failure. Words like failure and success didn't apply. Only a grand man or a man with a grand idea of his human worth could ignore the high money value of his estate and be content to live in its semi-ruin. My meditations in the manor were not of imperial decline. Rather, I wondered at the historical chain that had brought us together, he in his house, I in his cottage, the wild garden his taste, as I was told, and also mine. I knew that the life I had in the manor grounds was temporary, and couldn't last. The future was so easy to see, a hotel or school or foundation taking over the big house and setting the decayed grounds to rights, grounds where I now walked with such pleasure, and for the first time in my adult life, and more as my knowledge increased, felt in tune with the natural world. I dreaded change both here and on the drove way, and that was why, meeting distress halfway, I cultivated old, possibly ancestral ways of feeling, the ways of glory dead, and held on to the idea of a world in flux, the drum of creation in the god's right hand, the flame of destruction in his left. So for a week or more I balanced between the two things, anxiety, the idea of flux, when I heard, from beyond the churchyard, the sound of a bulldozer or something like it. The noise traveled through the ground, in vibrations. It was not a noise that a window could shut out. The cow sheds and dairy buildings beyond the churchyard were being pulled down, structures of clay tiles and red brick that had been so much part of the view as I came down the hill at the end of my walk, so natural and right, that I had not paid them too much attention. Now, with the sheds gone, the ground looked naked and ordinary, and the water meadows at the back were exposed, and the trees on the river bank. The clay tiles from the roofs were stacked up, the roof timbers were stacked up, and how new they looked, though the buildings had seemed to me so old. And then very quickly the open view was blocked out again, with a wide prefabricated shed with slatted timber walls, and with the printed name of the shed makers on a board or metal plate just below the apex of the roof. A shed like this, but without the slatted walls, had been put up, 1 or 2 owners or managers before, at the edge of the old farmyard over the hill, and not far from Jack's cottage, to store hay, to replace the cottage-shaped hayrick covered with black plastic sheeting on the droveway, that hayrick now moldering away, the black plastic itself weathered, without its luster and tension, no longer crackling when it flapped. Its texture now rather like the skin of very old people, like a faded rose petal. Change. New ideas, new efficiency. Before, on the roadside, at the entrance to the dairy yard, there had been a wooden platform where the milk churns were placed, set at that height to be easily picked up by the milk van or truck. There were to be no churns now. There were to be refrigerated tanks, and milk was to be collected by tanker. Next to the metal-walled barn at the top of the hill, another prefabricated cow shed was set up, and next to that, a modern milking building. This milking building or milking parlor, quaint word, was a mechanical-looking affair. Its concrete floor, set in a sloping field, looked like a concrete platform. It had pipes and meters and gauges, and the men who worked the parlor, who corralled the dung-stained cattle into the pens or channels, had something of the grimness of industrial workers. They drove up to the milking parlor in brightly colored cars, the colors noticeable up there, against the soft colors of the downs, green and brown in chalk and in the winter the blurred darkness of stripped trees. These cars, when parked, helped to make the milking parlor and the barn and the new prefabricated shed look like a little factory at the top of the hill. The parlor hissed mechanically, electrically. But the new prefabricated shed gave off a smell of dung. Some of the earth excavated for the foundations of the parlor had been dumped between the parlor and the paved lane. In this area, waste ground, grass grew thick and green, with a scattering of weeds and stray wheat. The brightly colored cars, the hum and hiss of the milking machine, the cows, even with their dung, reduced to machine-managed objects, the tense young men, conscious of their style, their jeans and shirts, their mustaches and cars, they were all aspects of the new, exaggerated thing that had come upon us. Twice a day the milk tanker went grinding up the hill, up the resurfaced lane, to empty the refrigerated milk tanks of the new milking parlor. With the farm tractors and the motor cars of the new workers, my walk in the lane beside the windbreak was at times like a walk on a public road. I had to watch for traffic. On the public road, the thatched cottage with the pink walls and the straw pheasant on the ridge of the roof lost a little more of its first character. So pretty, so like a postcard, when I had first seen it, so like something one had always known, with its rose hedge and its small, polished windows. The dairyman would have loved it too, I am certain. But like me at the beginning, he would have seen its beauty as a natural attribute of the country setting, and he had lived in the house as he might have lived in a house in the town from which he had come, without any feeling that anything was owed to the house in which he and his family lived, having all his life considered houses, even those in which he lived, as belonging to other people. Basins and pots and pans and bits of paper and tins and empty boxes had been left out in the garden, and some of those things had stayed there even after the dairyman and his family had gone. Now part of the hedge and the wire fence were taken down, so that the car of the new couple could be parked off the public road. The car was important to the new people, more important than the house. They were young people, without children, and they handled the house in a new way. It was a place of shelter, no more, temporary shelter for a temporary job. The wife sunbathed in the front garden whenever she could, and perhaps this was why the front door was often open. That open front door was very unsettling. The house as a place of shelter, not as a place to which you could transfer, or risk transferring, emotion or hopes. This attitude of the new couple to the thatched house seemed to match the more general new attitude to the land. The land, for the new workers, was merely a thing to be worked. And with their machines they worked it as though they intended to turn all the irregularities of nature into straight lines or graded curves. One day I saw a heavy, wide roller being pulled by a tractor through a field of young grass, already fairly tall though, and succulent looking. The roller appeared to be breaking the stalks of the grass and creating, as if spectrally, the effect of a striped, two-toned lawn. What was the point of that? The young man I asked seemed bemused. Perhaps he hadn't understood what I had said. He mumbled something which I couldn't understand, all his style breaking down at this moment of speech, and making me think back to the strangled speech, like gruff throat noises, of Jack's father-in-law. Dogs? Dogs. Worry pheasants. Even when what the young man said was made clear to me, it didn't make sense. The stalks were being crushed, he said, to encourage stronger growth. Another man said, on another day, that the point of the roller was to press down the Wiltshire flints into the ground, so that when the time came the grass could be cut without damage to the cutting machine. One Wiltshire flint, he said, and the flints of Wiltshire and of the downs of my daily walk were given an importance and malignity I had never attached to them. Could do thousands of pounds worth of damage to one of these machines. One new machine in particular I noticed. It made great rolls out of hay, great Swiss rolls of hay, as it were. These rolls, too big to be lifted or unrolled by a man, were manhandled by another impressive machine, a machine with iron grapples like giant scorpions' tails. A store of these rolls, in 2 layers, like a store of hay against some epic winter, was established far from the old farm buildings, in an unfenced, flint-rubbled valley off the droveway, just below the hill with the larks and the barrows, and from the top of which you had a sudden, near view of Stonehenge. So there were 3 stores of hay at different places, the Swiss rolls here, the golden rectangular-sided bales in the new hay shed at the edge of the old farmyard, and the bales, also rectangular-sided, in the rotting hayrick halfway down the straight stretch of the droveway. What was the point of the Swiss rolls? Was there an advantage over the traditional bales? I never knew until years later, when this section of my life was closed. The bales, tightly banded by the baling machines, had to be broken into by hand and then spread out for cattle. The big rolls had simply to be unrolled. A machine did the job in minutes. Such refinement. But perhaps the scale, for farming, was wrong. Perhaps time should never be as valuable as that, day after day. Perhaps when routines became as tight as that, they could too easily go awry. One broken link, and human ventures were always liable to error, could throw the entire operation out of true. Everything the new farm did was big. A very big silage pit was excavated at the bottom of the hill just across the lane from the windbreak, and not far from the cottages. There was only one old-fashioned aspect to that silage pit. It was covered by black plastic sheeting, and the things used to keep the plastic sheeting tight and in place were the things that in my experience had always been used for that purpose, old tires. They were bought in enormous numbers. Scores and scores of them must have been used, and scores of them were about at the bottom of the valley, in the droveway, just across from what used to be Jack's goose ground. Those tires, and the deep new silage pit with its braced-up wall of timber planks, and the banks of rubble from the digging for the pit, and the dark brown silage additive trickling out at the bottom, gave a touch of the rubbish tip to that part of the droveway where, when Jack lived, geese and ducks wandered about. With the old farm workers the first caution with strangers, the sizing up, was followed by a dumb friendliness, the country sociableness of people who spent hours alone in the fields in their tractors. The new workers, who were like city people in the country, city people in a larger workplace, didn't have that kind of friendliness. They hadn't come to the valley to stay. They saw themselves as people with a new kind of job and skill. They were almost migrant agricultural workers. They were people on the move. Quite a few came and went. I never got a smile from any of the people who moved into Jack's house after Jack's wife had left. She had said of the first lot of her new neighbors that they were snobbish people, who were interested in lawns and horses rather than old-fashioned cottage gardens. After some comings and goings, people who fitted that description settled in Jack's cottage. His greenhouse, the one bought as it seemed from a catalogue and once green with hanging plants, was empty, its glass murky with dust and rain, its timber frame weathered. One day it was taken down, revealing the concrete foundation or floor. The elaborate garden, with all its time-eating chores, was flattened. What was left didn't need much attention. No bedding out plants now, no forking over of the ground below the hawthorn tree, no delphiniums in the summer. The garden was flattened, all but 2 or 3 rose bushes and 2 or 3 apple trees which Jack had pruned in such a way that they bunched out at the top from a thick straight trunk. And the ground was grassed over. The hedge, once tight at the top, mud-spattered and ragged at the bottom, a half or quarter barrier between garden and rutted farm road, the hedge began to grow out into trees. Now more than ever the cottages appeared to have either front nor back, and to stand in a kind of waste ground. It matched the people and their attitude to the place. It matched the new way of farming, logic taken to extremes, the earth stripped finally of its sanctity, the way the pink-thatched cottage on the public road, once pretty with its rose hedge, had been stripped of its atmosphere of home by the people who looked to it only for shelter. But that might have been only my way of looking. I had known, for a short time, the straight stretch of the droveway open and unfenced. It had been fenced down the middle in my first year and had remained fenced, but I carried that earlier picture. I had arrived at my feeling for the seasons by looking at Jack's garden, adding events on the river and the Manor river bank to what I saw in his garden. But there were other ways of looking. Jack himself, giving the attention he gave to a meaningless hedge, a hedge that ran down the length of his garden and then abruptly stopped, saw something else, certainly. And perhaps the young children of the new people in Jack's cottage saw differently. They went to a junior school in Salisbury. The afternoon bus, bringing them back, set them down on the public road. Their mother picked them up in her car. Often on my afternoon walk I had to stand aside on the paved lane to allow the mother's car to pass. She never acknowledged my stepping aside. She behaved as though the lane were a public road and her car had the right of way. And I also never took in or properly noticed what she was like. Her personality was expressed for me only in the color and shape of her car, speeding up or down the hill, going to get her children, or coming back with them. I doubt whether any children in those farm cottages had been met like that off the school bus. What pictures of their time at the bottom of the valley, brief though that time was to be, would remain for them. What immense views, what a memory of emptiness, down the vast droveway and over the flinty slopes of the downs. At the foot of the paved lane down the hill, across from the silage pit, there was a narrow, little-used track, overgrown, hardly showing as a track, that ran along a dip in the downs to a small abandoned farm building, weathered, not very noticeable, something perhaps from the last century. In that lane one Saturday afternoon, when they were free from school in the bus, I saw the children from Jack's old cottage playing. Like prehistorical children, in a great solitude. But they were among the leftover tires of the silage pit. Certain ones had been turned into their toys, their pretend paddling rafts, and the whitening banks and mounds of excavated rubble sprouting scattered weeds, pale green with bright yellow flowers, and concrete blocks left over from the building. Friendship has its odd ways. I had thought of the couple who looked after the manor, Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, people in their 40s, as stern and self-sufficient, locked away and content in their manor job, and having a private and much less stern leisure life with old friends in a town somewhere. But then they developed a local friendship, and for some time I felt this friendship threaten my own life in the manor grounds. Across the lawn from my cottage, against the farmhouse wall of the squash court, not farmhouse, not squash court, against that wall with its studied mixture of flint, red brickbats and bits of stone, there grew 3 old pear trees. They had been carefully pruned and trained at one time, and even now the main branches, still pinned to the wall, created a formal effect, making the trees look like large candelabra. The seasons dressed these branches in different ways, and the view from my cottage was always rich. The trees bore fruit. Always a surprise, always seemingly sudden. But to me they were not fruit to eat, and only partly because the fruit belonged to the manor. They were part of the picture. In the great days of the manor 16 gardeners looked after the grounds and the orchard and the walled vegetable garden. So I was told. 16! How could anyone not running a plant nursery find 16 gardeners nowadays or pay their wages? How different the hamlets and villages round about must have been then, how many working people in little houses. The cottage where I lived had once been the garden office. Now I, who did nothing in the grounds, lived there. And there was only one gardener. He had a system. He used a hover mower to cut the lawns, at the back and side of the manor and in front of my cottage, 2 or 3 times in the summer, after a very low cut in the early spring. In the early spring he also laid down weed killer on the drive and the old gravel path around the cottage lawn, and on all those paths that had not been surrendered to grass. Once a year, in late August, he cut the tall grass and stalky weeds in the old orchard, where in the hollow knots of untended trees nestlings cheeped in the spring, and the trees themselves grew on, flowering at the correct time, bearing fruit, dropping fruit, attracting wasps. In the autumn he had a great leaf gathering. But his main work for much of the year was on the vegetable and flower garden, separated from the path at the back of my cottage by a high wall. The system worked. The garden had its wild parts, the water meadows were marsh, but elsewhere the gardener's attentions, slight but regular and with method, suggested a controlling hand. The gardener's name was Pitun. I called him Mr. Pitun at the start, and called him that to the very end. It was Pitun who one year, talking of the pear trees on the farmhouse wall, gave me a new determinative use of the preposition in. The pears were ripe. The birds were pecking at them. I mentioned it to Pitun, thinking that with all the things he had do he mightn't have noticed. But he said he had noticed. The pears were very much on his mind. He intended any day now to pick them in. To pick the pears in, I like that in. I played with it, repeated it, and though I don't believe I heard Pitun use the word in that way again, I associated it with him. Then, as the reader will learn about in more detail in a later place in this book, Pitun had to go. The manor couldn't afford him. And there were no more regular gardeners, where there had been 16. No one to look after the vegetables in the walled garden or cut the grass or weed kill the drive and paths or pick the pears in or keep the branches of the pear trees pinned to the squash court wall. The wind tore the upper branches of one tree free of the wall. The main trunk sagged forward, leaving a ghost-like outline in green-black on the wall. The branches drooped. The tree seemed about to break. But it didn't. The tree flowered, and at the foot of the wall in the summer, beside the path Pitun had once weed-killed, there grew up tall weeds that might have been chosen for their picturesque effect, shades of green, different degrees of transparency, different sizes of leaf. Above that, delicate white pear blossom turned to heavy fruit, at last. The birds became interested. No one now to pick the pears in, officially. But then one Sunday, from my bedroom window, I saw a curiously dressed man looking at the pear trees, assessing them, and then, tentatively, picking the pears on the lower branches. Strange people came into the manor grounds at various times. Pitun, when he had been there, had let in certain people. The Phillipses, the couple in the manor, had their own friends and visitors, and there were certain odd job people they employed. And very occasionally there were people connected with my landlord. The curiously dressed man was unusual. But I had no means of knowing whether he was a marauder, someone simply picking the pears, or whether he was someone who had authority, and was picking them in, for the use of the manor or people of whom the manor approved. He was curiously dressed. In army camouflage clothes, trousers, tunic, round-brimmed hat. The clothes didn't look like army surplus, or at any rate the stuff in the windows of the surplus stores. There was a quality of dash and swash in the cut, the camouflage pattern, and the muted colors. And curiously, with the dressiness there was an element almost of disguise, which made the man seem dangerous, like an intruder. As he looked at the trees, and with his tentative hands tugged at the lower pears, he turned from time to one side, his face still hidden by the camouflage collar and hat, in the direction of the manor courtyard, like a man nervous of being observed. But then, getting out the ladder from the garden shed next to the squash court, the shed that had been Pittons, placing the ladder against the wall, starting from the top and working methodically, carefully down, leaving nothing for the birds, bucket by bucket the man in army clothes picked the pears. And it became clear that he was picking them in, and that he was picking the pears of the old trees in because he had the blessing of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips in the manor. He had looked shifty at the beginning, uncertain, as though expecting someone to appear behind him. The person he must have been looking for appeared while he was on the ladder, because then, like a man apparently satisfied, he had concentrated on the pears. The person who had appeared was a girl, or, rather, a young woman, and she was half familiar to me. She walked on the lawn, and directly in front of my windows. The Phillipses never walked in front of my windows. They allowed me my privacy in the openness of the lawn. They were careful to walk on the far path, beside the squash court and the pear trees. This woman was going nowhere. She had come from the manor for a saunter on the lawn. She was short and heavy-hipped. Her tight jeans emphasized the slowness and smallness of her steps. She was like someone who had been granted the freedom of the grounds and was at that moment beginning to taste the new freedom. She too was unusually dressed. The extravagance was in her top, a shirt with the tails knotted in front, just below her breasts, leaving her midriff bare, not quite suitable at that time of year. She had been half familiar to me. Now I knew her. She was the woman I had seen sunbathing in the ruined garden of the thatched cottage. I had associated her so much with her cottage and garden and car and open front door that this sight of her in another, more open setting, and so close to me, was like the sight of a new person. And the man in army camouflage on the ladder was her farm worker husband. Here, on a Sunday afternoon, they were in the manor grounds, she strolling about the lawn, her hips tight in hard jeans folding horizontally, and almost in a straight line, into alternate lateral peaks, her husband picking pears, ripe fruit from old trees that might have been planted against the wall by the person who had designed the wall, trees once carefully tended and still, after years of neglect, showing signs of that early care. They, the woman with the midriff and the man in the army-style camouflage, must have attracted the Phillipses in some way. Perhaps the women had got on. Perhaps the men had got on. Perhaps the Phillipses were 10 to 15 years older. There might have been a cross-attraction of some sort. The woman with the midriff would have been important to the relationship. At any rate, the relationship between the four couldn't have existed without her support or encouragement. Already, and mainly from glimpses I had had of her in her ruined garden, lying on a cheap aluminum-framed easy chair, I had wondered about this woman. She had given me the impression of being at the center of passion, the cause of pain, a woman whose beauty caused pain to the man who at that moment was permitted to possess her, a woman who knew this. That impression, arrived at from a distance, was added to now by the clearer and fuller sight I had of her on the lawn. To the narrow waist, the full hips, the firm thighs and upper arms, the breasts, flesh without muscle, half revealed, half flattened by her sunbathing-like top, to this voluptuousness were now added the stare, rather than the fire, in her unsteady light eyes, the greediness expressed by her mouth with its seemingly swollen lower lip, and by the distinct spaces between her top front teeth. Her sexuality was precious to her, more precious than anything else. And here she was, in the grounds of the manor. And she was like someone in her own park, as though, just a few steps away from the clutter and constriction of the thatched cottage that had come with her husband's agricultural job, and which she couldn't therefore see as a real house, she had found a resort more suited to her style. She walked slowly up and down the lawn, as though making herself familiar with a new pleasure. And the man in the army camouflage stood on the ladder and picked the pears, keeping his back to her, not turning round to look for her, as though he was now content, with his wife being where she was, with him. Perhaps they and the Phillipses had come together as town people, working in the country but separate from the life of country people. Town people, but servants, all four, with their special style and pride, sharing now the grounds and privileges of the manor, offering and returning hospitality. I couldn't tell who out of the four was benefiting most from the relationship. The person with most at stake was Les, the farm worker, who spent hours away from his wife, in his own solitude, in his tractor cab, seeing the tedium of a particular job physically expressed in the extent of a great down, perhaps without trees or windbreak, moving slowly back and forth, his thoughts no doubt often going back to the woman in the thatched cottage. The grandeur of the manor, the grounds, the gardens, the river, these were like things he could present her with now, another side of what was to be found in the country, some little reward for the desolation of her life in that valley which others thought beautiful, and in that thatched cottage which others thought picturesque, but was picturesque only to people with another kind of life, different resources, another idea of what was owed them. I was nervous of Brenda. She had no great regard for me. She had her own idea of what was to be respected, and the way I lived, a middle-aged man in a small cottage, and the work I did, if she had found out, didn't fit into that idea. In this she was different from the Phillipses, who saw me as artistic, a version of their employer, and had always been protective. There was a difference of generations here. But it was this difference that, over and above common interests, lay at the heart of the relationship between the four. The older people glamored by the style and boldness of the younger. Brenda was being groomed to serve in the manor when the Phillipses were on holiday or wished to take a day off. They had been looking for some time for a suitable person, someone compatible as well, a friend, yet someone who would not be a threat. And the prospect of a part-time light job in the manor for Brenda, the prospect of having the run of the little wild estate, the gardens, the orchard, the riverbank walks, this bound the younger people to the Phillipses. And that took some understanding, that people like Brenda and Les, who were so passionate, so concerned with their individuality, their style, the quality of their skin and hair, it took some understanding that people who were so proud and flaunting in one way should be prepared in another corner of their hearts or souls or minds to go down several notches and be servants. They were servants, all four. Within that condition, which should have neutered them, all their passions were played out. But that might have been my own special prejudice, my own raw nerves. I came from a colony, once a plantation society, where servitude was a more desperate condition. Les was under pressure. From his work on the farm, and his uncertainty about what was going to happen with that very big venture, if it failed, he would have to move on, find another position. From his obsession with Brenda, whose beauty so obviously tormented him, possession of the woman not enough, constantly reminding him of what he might lose. And pressure, too, from his increasingly dependent relationship with the Phillipses. He wished to keep the footing he had obtained in the manor. He wished Brenda, to whom it mattered, to continue to enjoy the freedom of the grounds. To do so he had to put himself in some ways in the power of the Phillipses, had to some extent, after the servitude of his own job, to serve them. He cut the grass on the various lawns, a big job. He made himself busy on Saturdays and Sundays with his hammer and saw, mending bridges over the creeks, black with rotting leaves, in the water meadows, keeping a path clear to the river bank. He even tried to revive some of the vegetable plots of the walled garden, between the paths, a wilderness of weeds in the old sifted earth, many times forked over and fertilized, but the garden as a whole still showing a fair amount of its original design and, like the pear trees, preserving after many years of care something of its formality, even with the wire netting and coops and rough carpentry and basins. All the abandoned intentions of the various odd-job people who had worked in the garden and grounds after Piton had left. Les worked on the vegetable plots in the evenings, after his work on the farm. Energy! But this late work on the vegetables became an irritation to me. He used the sprinkler then, and the flow of water there set up a high-pitched vibration in the old metal pipes that ran through my own cottage, so that my cottage hissed and hummed while the sprinkler played. Piton and his successors had used the garden hose or sprinkler during the day, but the noise then had been muffled by the noises of the day. In the silence of the evening, the old silence of the country, even with the electric light glow in the sky of the towns all around, a silence so pure that the trains going in and out of Salisbury Station 6 or 7 miles away could be heard sometimes when I went out of my cottage door. In the evening those hissing pipes could be clearly heard, and couldn't be ignored. I did something I hadn't done before. I telephoned Mrs. Phillips at the manor to complain. I was expecting her to be combative and protective towards her friends. To my surprise, she made no fuss. She accepted what I said about the peculiar nuisance of the hissing pipes in the evening, and said she would go and turn the sprinkler off herself. She did that, and the abrupt silence in the cottage, coming at first like a ringing in the ears or the head, a noise of cicadas, was like a blessing. What accidents had given me my life in the cottage? What accidents protected it? How little it would have taken to alter the whole feel of the place, and to drive me away. A disturbance like the sprinkler late in the evening, or Brenda walking too often outside my window, or too many strangers making free of the lawn outside, or too many parties and visitors in the servants' quarters of the manor. Mrs. Phillips had been cooperative. But I expected after this that there would be a certain awkwardness with her, and a more pronounced awkwardness, long building up, with Brenda and less. And such was my mood, my acceptance of the inevitability of change, my idea that things lasted for their season, such was the effect of my training myself to say, "Well, at least I have had this for a year," and, "At least I have had this for 2 years," that I was half prepared to feel that my life on the estate had changed for good. But there was no awkwardness with Mrs. Phillips or Mr. Phillips, and no awkwardness at all with Les. In fact, Les, with whom I had so far had little to do, made a friendly move towards me. And he did so the very next day. At the time when the sprinkler might have been turned on, and from my kitchen door I might have seen the arc or fan of the parallel water jets, hypnotically appearing and disappearing, waxing and waning against the late southern sky, above the high wall of the vegetable garden, the wall that ran beside the little lane at the back of my cottage. At that time he knocked at my kitchen door. Technically it was a back door, but it was the only door I used to go in and out of my cottage. I saw him through the high glass panes in the door. He was bareheaded when I opened. His camouflage hat, a relic of the camouflage outfit, was in one hand, and he was offering some vegetables in a basin. The gesture of offering was graceful, classical, and he was smiling. The picture remained with me, the lean, sunken-cheeked, tanned face, the hat held in one hand, the two hands together holding the basin with the vegetables, the smile. Yet what was also noticeable about him was his lack of beauty. And this was now noticeable because I had expected a man of good looks, from his physique, the way he carried himself, his clothes. His chin was heavy. His teeth were bad, they mocked his smile. His skin was marked. And yet he had worked hard at his looks. His hair was stylishly cut, soft, freshly washed. I understood now why he always wore unusual or elegant hats. They helped. From a distance he looked good in hats. I understood also a little of the anxiety I had sensed in him about Brenda, as well as a little more of Brenda's manner, the manner of a woman who was still owed a lot. When the Phillipses went on their holiday, Brenda took over at the manor. She moved into the Phillipses' quarters. Les stayed on in the thatched cottage. I had to be away for a few days at this time. On the morning after I got back, I went to the manor to get my letters. My letters were kept there when I was away. That was the arrangement with the Phillipses. I rang at the kitchen door in the manor courtyard. I heard music inside. Brenda was a long time coming. She would have been deep in the Phillipses' quarters. They had elegant rooms. They had a sitting room with a stone terrace leading out onto the back lawn, which had been laid out 50 or more years before and had big trees and flower beds and old rose bushes and old pieces of garden statuary. In the distance, the marsh of the water meadows, the river, and the meadows and the down on the other bank. To this, on the stone terrace just outside, the Phillipses had added bird tables and pendant seed bells, at which tits and other birds pecked. Brenda was carefully got up. Jeans and blouse. Her full lips painted, something done to her eyelashes, emphasizing the stare of her unsettling blue eyes. Her appearance at the same time suggesting an immense idleness in the Phillipses' quarters. Servant and not servant, and now not particularly attentive to me. She said she had seen no letters. At her back was the big kitchen of the manor, which, from what they told me, the Phillipses had done up or caused to be done up. A warm, inviting kitchen, with a big stove and many cupboards, thick walls, small windows set in deep embrasures, the electric lights on, a feeling of space and protection, of doors opening into corridors and big rooms standing beside big room. Shortly after she came back, Mrs. Phillips telephoned me to say that there were many letters for me at the manor. When I went to her kitchen to get them, I told her that Brenda had told me there were none. Mrs. Phillips didn't seem displeased to hear this. No explanation, no comment, just a hint of a nod. She was like someone digesting a piece of news, adding it to what she already possessed. And I felt that Mrs. Phillips had changed her mind about Brenda, that once again, as had happened with other people she had tried out as her holiday replacement, Mrs. Phillips had found a reason for recoiling from having a stranger in her kitchen and rooms. Brenda might have been the central person at the beginning of the relationship between the four. But now Mrs. Phillips was more important. I was not surprised then when Brenda stopped appearing in the manor. But I was not prepared for the news Mrs. Phillips gave one day. "She's run off to Italy with Michael Allen," she said. Michael Allen was a central heating contractor. He was a young man with a newish business. He had profited from the old-fashioned ways of the older central heating and plumbing firms, used to dealing with big houses, used to being well thought of, but burdened by the expensive town center premises and large staffs of older days. I had got to know Michael Allen after he had come to the manor to do something about a boiler that had exploded. I asked him about the hissing pipes in my cottage. He said in his brisk way that the only cure for that as well as for other things in the manor was to scrap the entire plumbing system, all those antiquated metal pipes. I remembered his confidence, the way he walked, the way he came into my cottage. He actually had a little strut. He was a country fellow and a great boaster. In the short time we spoke, he boasted about many things. He asked me nothing about myself. He employed 6 people, he said. He intended to retire when he was 40. In a bigger town, in London, say, people like Michael Allen do not really have personalities. Their personalities seldom make an impression and do not matter. They or their employees come out of the streets, do their jobs, and return to the streets. They disappear. They are hardly their names. They are more their telephone numbers and their bills. In a place like the Valley, the entry of the same kind of person into your house is more of a social occasion. He comes with more readable attributes and many more points of contact: his village or small town, his neighbors sometimes, his education, his background, the houses and people he has served, and the services and shops he in his turn shares with you. Michael Allen boasted. He saw himself as a man of energy and ambition, and for this reason untouched by the recession other people complained about. He saw himself as adventurous, several cuts above the general run of people who didn't have the courage or the spirit to go into business on their own and were content to be employed by others. His looks were passable. He had a mustache, of the current fashion. But after that meeting I remembered more his absurd pride and boastfulness, and the strutting, almost hands in pockets way he came into the cottage, as though he were doing it and me a favor. I saw his van sometimes in Salisbury. Once or twice I saw him and his van outside the Safeway supermarket. Michael didn't like that, being seen using his van as a car. I saw his van outside Brenda and Leslie's cottage, and in the courtyard of the manor. But that wasn't surprising. I was used to seeing his van, as well as the vans of certain local builders, up and down the valley. Certain tradesmen were never idle. But Italy! What old-fashioned idea of romance had sent Michael and Brenda there? What film or television show? Or was it, more simply, that Michael had been there on a package holiday and felt safer with what he knew? But wasn't that going abroad itself a sign of the brevity of the passion? How could Michael give up his 6 employees, his local reputation, his van with his name painted on the sides and the back? How long before he wished to return, not only to that fame and career, but also to his old life? And so it happened. Brenda reappeared. Not in the manor. That interlude was over. Even before Brenda had gone away, Les had stopped coming to the manor, had given up the vegetable garden, the hammering on weekends, the doing of odd jobs about the grounds. All that effort to put things right, all that effort of heart and hand, had gone to waste. The manor had swallowed it up. Waste. But the manor had given things in return, had given pleasure, had given Les for many weeks the freedom of its wild grounds. Just as, Before Les and Brenda had come to the thatched cottage, the country life and its seeming secrecy had given the dairyman from the town some genuine new idea of the beauty of the days. Now the manor was in the past, and Les had retreated to his thatched cottage, never romantic to him, and now no doubt the wretchedest of places for him, had retreated to the solitude and noise of his tractor cab, going up and down the immense slopes of the downs, considering earth and dust, now black, now brown, now white, and the physical desolation of his fields. I had seen him at one of his best moments, appearing at the door with his vegetables, offering them with that classical gesture, and a smile of pure goodwill, the smile of a man receiving at that time a little love from the person he loved, and passing a bit of it back to the people around him. For Brenda, that return, not just from Italy, but from Italy to the cottage, must have been awful. After half queening it in the grounds of the manor, and queening it for a full fortnight in the quarters of the Phillipses, with that grand view from the sitting-room of the lawn and statues and old trees and the river. She had asked for so much from her beauty, so much, and then she had asked so much again. Mrs. Phillips said of Brenda, "Michael kicked her out." And that was all. Michael. The use of the first name pointed to some new attachment on Mrs. Phillips's part, some new, or old, sympathy, something born of that town life, pub, club, or hotel bar, which at one time might have involved them all, Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, Brenda and Les, and Michael Allen. It was a good thing that the autumn was well advanced. No question now of Brenda's having to show herself to anybody, to prove that she was unabashed and that life was going on. She could close her front door and stay indoors, just as Les could take out his tractor and hide behind the tinted plastic of his cab. The farming organization that had brought these town people to the valley, and had in their own way remade parts of the valley, was fading, for reasons I didn't know. With such ventures it was as with the military exercises on the ground or in the air that were so often with us, one saw a great deal, but understood little. Les was looking, it was said, for another job. 3 or 4 times I saw Brenda and Les on the road in their little dark red motor car. They had taken down part of the fence and the hedge to make a space for that car in the garden. And the thatched cottage had indeed been no more than temporary shelter. To have invested more in it emotionally would have been a waste, more of a waste than Les's evening and weekend work in the manor grounds. The first time I saw them in their car after they had stopped coming to the manor there was some kind of half-recognition from Les. From Brenda there was none. Perhaps there had been some trouble with Mrs. Phillips over my letters, the letters being put forward by her as a cause, and I had not been forgiven. On the later occasions I saw them there was nothing at all. Our brief acquaintance was over. There was a van that I also saw, the van of Michael Allen, going importantly about on its central heating business. Country town success. Michael had given me a glimpse of that side of things here. But Italy! Who would have associated romance with that van and the name painted on the sides and the back of the van, painted in 3 places? Whenever I saw the van I thought of Mrs. Phillips's words. Michael kicked her out. How hard it must have been for Les and Brenda to live with those words, which others must also have heard. The days shortened. The way below the yews from the public road to the manor drive and to my cottage, that way was so dark at 4 in the afternoon that when I went shopping in Salisbury on the mid-afternoon bus I needed to take a flashlight for the short walk back from the bus stop. Country darkness. Big things could happen almost secretly. And one such thing happened in the thatched cottage with the straw pheasant on the roof. It was Mrs. Phillips who gave me the news. She said 2 days after the event, "Brenda's dead." She added, and it seemed calmly, "Les murdered her." Murdered, the formal word, rather than killed. We use formal words, even empty words, when events are big. I thought of the way they had both appeared on the lawn during the pear picking, 2 birds in bright plumage. I thought of the face of the satisfied lover offering me the vegetables at the kitchen door, the gift of the happy man. Then I thought of Italy and the Michael Allen van going about its money-making business, spreading the name around, while Les was running about in his red car looking for a new job. So hard to contemplate, the physical act, the setting, the finality, the body, just a few hundred yards away. I thought of the least intrusive question I might ask. Where did he kill her? Right in that cottage. On Saturday night. Saturday night? Was it a night of drink and temper? It wasn't what I associated with them, Mrs. Phillips said. She taunted him. And taunted, I felt to be a technical word, as technical as murdered. It had sexual connotations. She, the Italian runaway, had done the sexual taunting. She had not come back abashed. She had done the taunting, the goading. How often, to punish someone for her Italian failure, she must have taunted him. And it was hard not to feel that she didn't have some idea of what she was provoking. And how, having started on the job of destruction, he had used the kitchen knife, having started on that, from which very quickly there was no turning back, however much in a corner of his mind he might have been wishing it all undone, healed again, how he must have struck, until the madness and the life was over. All in that little thatched cottage with the ruined garden. Worker bees work till they die. When they die, other bees clear the hive, get rid of the bodies. Because bees work, and are clean. And so, without disturbance, without many people knowing, even people on the bus, the cottage was cleansed and cleared of its once precious life, its once precious passions. She taunted him, it was the verdict. And all hearts were with the living, the survivor, the man, as, had it occurred the other way, they would have been with the woman. The police were discreet, hardly seen, almost as secretive as the event itself. More information was to be had from the local weekly paper than from immediate neighbors. They had seen very little, and didn't want to blame one partner more than the other, everyone drawn close at this moment to Brenda and Les, seeking to remember them, and responding to this very near event almost as to a family tragedy. One local formality remained. Brenda's things had to be collected. And some weeks later, before the winter turned to spring with the gales of spring, Brenda's sister came to collect Brenda's things from the unoccupied cottage, where there was no longer a dark red motorcar. Collecting the dead person's things, it was like something from the old world, an aspect of the idea of sanctity, an aspect of decent burial, the honoring of the dead, and it seemed to call for some ritual. But there was none. The coming for the dead woman's things was matter of fact. I wouldn't have known about it if I wasn't in the kitchen of the manor, settling some little bill with Mrs. Phillips, when Brenda's sister came to call. Mrs. Phillips knew Brenda's sister. It was another indication of the Phillipses' town life, their life outside the manor and the village. Mrs. Phillips became much graver when Brenda's sister said what she had come for. I was moved myself. And we all went, after introductions, to Mrs. Phillips's sitting room with its view of the down and the river, the water meadows and the big aspens of the garden, the old stone terrace, the urns, the moss, the mottled stone, the seed bells for the birds, the lines of washing, the mixture of big house garden and backyard domesticity which I had seen, through rain and mist, on my first day in the grounds when, hardly knowing where I was or understanding what I saw, I had called on the Phillipses. Thereafter I had seen that view only at Christmas time, those years when I was not abroad, when I called on the Phillipses to give them my presents. Brenda's sister was not immediately like Brenda. She was older, fatter. There was a quality in the fatness, the puffiness, which suggested illness, a clinical condition, rather than grossness. Brenda's heaviness, in hips and thighs, had been different. It had suggested someone spoilt, someone who felt that her beauty entitled her to luxurious sensations and felt at the same time that her beauty could support a certain amount of self-indulgence. But then I began to see Brenda's full lips and wild eyes in her sister's face, saw those features lost or altered in puffy flesh, saw, too, the smoothness of skin and purity of complexion which would have given the girl, when she was a girl, a high idea of herself and her potential, but which was now part of the breathy wreck she had become. Things had not gone well for these sisters. In different ways their gift of beauty had turned out to be a torment for them. Brenda's sister lived in a small, newish town to the south, between Salisbury and Bournemouth, not town, not country, not the sort of desolate place she had thought she would end up in. In the Phillipses' sitting room it was for a while as though Brenda's sister's call was a purely social one. But then she seemed suddenly to remember what had brought her. She said, "You want to save everything. And then you want to throw everything away." Her voice broke. Her eyes went watery. She laughed so little. Her clothes. She tried to smile. She was so particular about her clothes. But what can I do about her clothes? No ill will, no anger, no wish for revenge. She said. She was too much for him. He couldn't handle her. Mrs. Phillips allowed Brenda's sister to talk on. Brenda's sister said. She even thought he was queer. Did you know that? She told me he washed his hair every morning. Not in the evening after work, because he didn't want to sleep on it when it was wet. But in the morning. He is like my son Raymond. I hope nobody thinks he is queer because he does that. Raymond does it for the girls at his school. I had always assumed it was Brenda who had encouraged Les to dress up, and had thought that she had chosen things for him. This news about the washing of the hair suggested a lonelier and more desperate man. Brenda's sister said. She expected so much from her life. My mother drilled it into us how much she suffered before the war, living in a little army house, hoping for great things to happen to my father. And that was all that ever happened to us. We lived in a little army house. The story she told us was that her father, a simple serviceman with some factory experience, had had a fleeting moment of inspiration early in the war. He had hit on a new way of mounting guns in the tail of an airplane, and from being a simple serviceman he had been taken up by the authorities for a few months. He was not alone, though. There were many others like him, men with ideas. Always he was on his way to Ministry of Defense. Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Defense. I heard those words all the time. When I see the advertisements in the paper today and see the same words, it brings it back. I didn't think she was romancing. Her use of the words, Ministry of Defense, without the definite article, that the average person would have wanted to add, was convincing. It suggested that she knew the words as well as she had said. But nothing had happened to her father. Guns were changed, aircraft were modified or replaced, and the serviceman had become ordinary again. But his daughters had inherited through their mother a dream of glory together with a general pessimism, a wishing to hope and a nervousness about hoping. It made for temperament, frustration, self-destructiveness. It is as if we all carry in our makeup the effects of accidents that have befallen our ancestors, as if we are in many ways programmed before we are born, our lives half outlined for us. Brenda's sister said. I can't talk. I didn't do so well myself. She had married a builder who, when she had at last got out into the world, got away from the little army house, had seemed to her immensely prosperous and stylish, but had then seemed less so, had fallen on hard times, had done even worse when, trying to change his luck, he had set up in business in Germany, and had then been unfaithful with a younger woman, as glamoured by his manner as Brenda's sister once had been. He had finally left home, left his wife and child. An old story, that was what Brenda's sister said, and that was the way she told it, playing down the drama. As usual, Muggins was the last to know. All her care now was for her son. He was her sole interest. She had narrowed herself down to that. So, though she didn't make the point, there was a pattern to her life. Her father had been replaced by her husband, and her husband by her son. Her life had repeated. She had lived the same life or versions of the same life. Or, looking at it another way, almost as soon as it had begun, her life of choice and passion had ended, as it had ended for her father, her mother, and possibly for generations of her ancestors. All Brenda's sister's talk of herself came out without prompting, and her hysteria became noticeable. So it was possible, after her early calmness, even formality, in Mrs. Phillips's sitting room, with the grand view, to see Brenda's sister as an ill person, someone more marked than Brenda had been by their family past, the past that had really been the absence of a great event. And it was possible at the same time to see in her not only more and more reminders of Brenda's looks, but also something, like another side, of Brenda's passions. Such varied passions, so many roots, so little understood, even by the people who had become victims of those passions. Then the hysterical woman with the still smooth skin, the still unblotched color, remembered her social graces. The call was over. She had to do what she had come to do, collect the things of her sister, who had left so little behind. We left the sitting room. A corridor, thick walls, stone mullions in the window, a door to the big kitchen. And there at the portico Mrs. Phillips said goodbye. When we were out of the manor courtyard and on the rough, stony drive, Brenda's sister said, and it was sudden after her apparent trustingness in the sitting room, "I don't think I will ever forgive Mrs. Phillips." She was distressed. I began to walk with her to the road. As we walked below the yews, she told me of Brenda's flight to Italy. Michael Allen had gone by air. Brenda had gone by train. During that journey, hearing so little English, talking so little to people, she had thought a lot about what she was doing, and she had become afraid. By the time she reached Rome, she had decided not to go to Michael. She thought she would go and stay at a hotel and get a message to Leslie, even send for him. She had a little money, enough for a few days. She booked into a hotel near the railway station. There was no telephone at home, in the thatched cottage. So she had telephoned the manor and asked for a message to be passed on to Leslie. Nothing had happened, no word came from Leslie. Then, swallowing her pride, because there had been some quarrel between them, Brenda had telephoned the people in Jack's old cottage. The woman who drove fast up the hill in her motorcar to collect her children from the school bus every weekday afternoon, and had never smiled at me. The woman who had leveled Jack's garden. But still no message came from Leslie. By this time Brenda's money had run out. She had then done what she had decided not to do. She had gone after all to Michael Allen and had been with him until, as we had all been told, he had kicked her out. She had come back aggrieved, angry, in a mood to taunt the man she regarded or pretended to regard as a queer, not fully a man. She felt mocked by the romantic impulse that had thrilled and sustained her for a while in the hotel near the railway station in Rome. The girl in need, the girl in danger, the lover eager at the other end. Leslie should have done everything, sold everything, to go to her. But there had been no word from Leslie. Brenda's sister said, "Mrs. Phillips never passed the message to Leslie. She did it 4 or 5 days later, when Brenda had left the hotel and was with Michael. She said she forgot. She said other things came up. She said she didn't think it was all that important. But I think it was deliberate." From the woman who lived in Jack's old house, Brenda's sister said she didn't expect anything. But this story gave a new character to the woman, and the shape and color of her car, racing up the hill to meet her young children off the afternoon school bus. One day, late in the summer, walking past the old farm buildings and what had been Jack's cottage and garden, the junk and ruins which had formed no part of Jack's vision of a world ever renewed, ruins to which now, across the droveway, was added a burning pit in the chalk for industrial-looking rubbish, the fire of which occasionally singed the silver birches planted years before to screen the old patch of waste ground. One day, walking past the farm and its spreading litter and on up to where the Swiss rolls of hay had been stacked and were already going black and brilliant green with new shoots of grass, I heard the sound of a great fire behind the young wood, and that wood was no longer so young. I heard the sound behind the trees, saw the smoke, and between the black of the tree trunks, the flames in the field beyond, the heat waves distorting the view like a pane of old-fashioned glass, felt the heat, and then very quickly was engulfed by the noise, rising fast to an amazing crepitation. And I thought of another sound I had heard more than 25 years before in the highlands of northeastern South America, the sound of a big waterfall. Water, fire, in great disturbance they made the same sound. And fleetingly to me, walking on the downs in that overpowering noise, it seemed that all matter was one. On the way back, the fire quickly burned away, finished, ashes in the field behind the wood. On the way back from my walk then and afterwards, the thick patch of moss below the dormer window on the thatched roof of the empty house, a green that was shining, unnatural, that green, once part of the beauty of thatch, seemed to stand for more than vegetable matter. So quiet the thatched house now, so ruined the little garden once neat with its hedge, scores of small roses in the summer. And so quiet, over the hill on the other side, at the bottom of the valley, where an old, grass-over field track led to a small abandoned farm building, all black and rust in a little dip in the land, so quiet when I saw them on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, in the silence of the empty downs, the children from what had been Jack's cottage, playing amid the rubble, whitening, sprouting a few weeds with yellow flowers, and the tires of the silage pit. And there, perhaps, Jack's vision of the valley as a whole place would continue, a vision without the decadence that was in my eye, a vision of childhood that would expand in the adult mind. There were others who saw the valley and drove away as a place without decay. Walking one day past the old farm buildings, past the fresh litter below the birch trees, the fire in the chalk pit, turning up towards the new wood, I saw a figure in the distance. I was used to solitude on the walk. The sight of a person in the distance like this, with the prospect of an encounter 10 or 15 minutes ahead, could spoil all the intervening walk and the walk back as well, because the person encountered would be likely to be walking back himself, usually to a parked car at the far end of the droveway, where it met one of the highways. I preferred, therefore, if I saw a person approaching, to give up the walk and turn back. This time, however, I didn't. The person I was walking towards turned out to be a middle-aged woman. She was quite small. In the distance, and especially when seen against the sky, she had seemed physically imposing. People stood out in the emptiness. Her greeting just before we crossed was easy, open. We stopped and spoke. She was a working woman from Shrewton. When she lived at Amesbury, she said she had regularly done the walk we were both now doing. She had come out now to look for the deer. So we had that in common as well. She said she had worked out the circuit of the deer. She knew roughly where they crossed the public road. And it was extraordinary, the survival of the family of deer in a piece of land bounded on 3 sides by busy highways and on one of those sides in addition by the army firing ranges. No decay in that woman's eye. Downs, walks, deer, the wonder of the natural world as available as it had always been. And no decay in the eye of the old farm manager either. I saw him one day on a horse on the rising stretch of the droveway between the wood on one side and a treeless field or pasture on the other, before the hill with the larks and the barrows on the brow of the hill. In the old days he had seldom come so far on his inspection tours in his Land Rover. But now he was retired and could roam, and he was on a horse, a further sign of leisure. It was a big horse, of a beautiful color, white or gray spotted or spattered with red-brown. It was a difficult horse, he said. It was the gift of his daughter, who had married and gone to live in Gloucestershire. And that was what his talk was about, his daughter, so good with horses, and her gift of the horse, no trouble to her, that animal. His suburban house at the very edge of the antique droveway, his neat garden, his daughter grown up and gone away, and now the empty days. How quickly his time had passed! How quickly a man's time passed! So quickly, in fact, that it was possible within a normal span to witness, to comprehend, 2 or 3 active life cycles in succession. That wasn't what I thought about when I met him. When I met him on the horse that he was finding so difficult, he dismounted, with some relief, to talk to me. I thought at first only that it was true what some people said, that people who retired after active or physically energetic lives aged fast. He had aged. He had become bent. His walk was stiff, the walk in which, when I had first seen him and thought him to be an exemplar of the farmer type, I had seen a farmer's walk. The other thought, about the shortness of a man's active cycle, his doing period, came to me afterwards, when I had left the manor and my cottage, when that section of my life had closed, and I had begun to feel, myself, that energy and action were things no longer absolutely at my command, that everyone had been given his particular measure of energy, and that when it was used up, it was used up. These thoughts came to me not many years after I had seen the manager on his difficult horse, and seen the gap between us in age and energy and expectations. But middle age or the decline associated with it comes abruptly to some people, and middle age had come as abruptly to me as old age appeared to me then to have come to the old manager. I would have liked to hear the old manager say something about the new farm people. I would have then said, more in tribute to him as someone from my past than because I understood what I saw of the farming around me, how much I preferred his way. But he wasn't interested. So the solidarity went unexpressed. And it was just as well. Because eventually, mysteriously, at least to me, the new venture failed, after 2 harsh, dry summers so harsh that the old mock orange shrub outside my cottage died. During one of those droughts I heard talk, on the bus, and from Bray the car hire man, that water wasn't to be brought to the cattle, but that the cattle were to be transported to where there was water, transported perhaps to Wales. Such was the scale and style and reputation of the new venture. I don't know whether anything like that happened, or whether it was just excited local exaggeration. Soon, however, it didn't matter. The venture failed. And even this failure, large as it was, affecting so many people, affecting the eventual appearance of so many acres, seemed to happen quietly. It was some time before I knew that there had been failure. The machines were there, the cows were there, the men were up and down in their cars, the big trucks came to take away the grain from the metal-walled barn. But then gradually the failure, the withdrawal at the center, began to show. The prefabricated cow shed next to the barn was opened, front and back, and cleared of its dung and straw, and it remained open and clean, though stained, and empty. The stalls, the concrete floor with its canals, the slatted timber of the walls striping the sunlight, radiating it at many angles, and giving the shed an internal glow. The new milking building or parlor was taken down. So newly put up, its concrete platform, all that remained, still so new and raw-looking on the hillside. It was like Jack's greenhouse. That, too, had left only a concrete floor. Again, here, building had been on too big a scale too big for men. Needs had been exaggerated, had ramified, and had left a ruin. An empty cow shed that might eventually be taken down and sold elsewhere. A milking machine that no doubt had already been sold, leaving only a concrete floor. So small in the openness now, that floor, where the milking machines had hummed and hissed and dials had kept check of this and that, while the dung-stained cows, corralled into their iron-railed passages at particular times, had waited with a curious stillness to give milk to the machines, after being walked up the hill to the cowmen's shouts, the only human remnant of the milking ritual. The cows themselves eventually disappeared. Some would have been sold, but whether sold or not, what would have happened to them would have been what always happened to cows when their time was judged to have come. Batches of them were regularly taken off in covered vans to the slaughterhouse. I had seen the cows on the hillsides against the sky, heads down, grazing, or looking with timorous interest at the passing man. And they had seemed like the cows in the drawing on the label of the condensed milk tins I knew in Trinidad as a child, something to me as a result at the very heart of romance, a child's fantasy of the beautiful other place, something which, when I saw it on the downs, was like something I had always known. I had seen the big eyes, the occasional mild stampede of the herd as, within their pasture, they had followed the walking man, thinking he had brought them something tasty or was to lead them to something they had been trained to like. I had seen the big, wet, black noses, the fly repellent in the metal sachets clipped to the ears, which they flapped like heavy fans. One sees what one sees. Harder to imagine, unreal, what one doesn't see. It had taken me some time to see that though milk came from cows that had dropped calves, no calf was to be seen, except very sick ones, little, seemingly fluid sacks of black and white or brown and white on straw, creatures still seeming fresh from the womb. And no cow with its calf. No lowing herd winding o'er the lea here, as in Gray's elegy. No, sober, herd lowing to meet their young at evening's close, as in The Deserted Village. Pictures of a special beauty at one time, those lines of poetry, matching the idea of the cows on the condensed milk label. A special beauty, because though I knew that sober, well, lovely, apt word, and knew the ritual of bedding down cattle for the night, we had no herds like that on my island. We didn't have the climate, the pasture. The island had been developed for the cultivation of sugarcane. But there were cattle. Some members of my family, like other country people, kept cows, one or two, for milk, for love, for religion. We were at the very end of the old Aryan cow worship, the worship of the cow that gave milk, without which men's life would have been harder, and in some climates and lands impossible. This worship was something our grandfathers had brought with them from peasant India. When I was a child, we still honored the idea for its own sake, as well as for its link with the immemorial past. Among us, the new milk from a cow that had just calved was almost holy. A special sweet was made from this very rich milk and sent by the cow's owner to friends and relations, sent in very small portions, like a consecrated offering from a religious rite. Our few cows, perhaps like grays or goldsmiths' herds, were poor things compared with the healthy, big animals on the downs. But these animals on the downs, even with their beauty, were without the sanctity, the constant attention of men, which as a child I thought cows craved. These cows in railed pastures or meadows had numbers scored into their rumps. No sanctity at birth, and none at death, just the covered van. And sometimes, as once in the derelict, mossy yard at the back of Jack's cottage, there were reminders of assisted insemination or gestation going wrong, when for some days, isolated from the animals that had all come out well, oddly made cattle were penned up there, with that extra bit of flesh and hair, with the black and white Frisian pattern, hanging down their middle, as of cow material that had leaked through the two halves of the cow mold. And now, with the disappearance of the cattle, there came to the old and new lanes and ways of the downs around the farm, whose life might have seemed to the visitor unchanging and ritualized, a moment of stasis, suspense. There had been great activity. Now there were more ruins than ever. The manor in whose grounds I lived, so many of its rooms shut up, the gardens of the manor, the forested orchard, the children's house there, with the conical thatched roof, the thatch rotting, the thick stack of the damp reeds slipping out of the wire netting in one place, creating the effect at the bottom of a diagonal slicing of the reeds, the squash court that was not squash court or farmhouse, the old granary with the double pyramidal roof. Beyond the renovated church, the old farm buildings had been taken down and replaced by the prefabricated shed, which was now empty, with the round convex silver mirrors at the entrance to the cow yard as reminders of the traffic that had once been. The pink house with the green-stained thatched roof and the shredding straw pheasant on the roof, its garden now a piece of waste ground. The new barn and the new half-slatted cow shed at the top of the hill with the windbreak of pine and beech, trees which had grown so much since I had first seen them. At the bottom of that hill, the silage pit with the thick timber plank walls against the excavated hillside, the timber planks stained with creosote, the tires all around, bought in such number from people who dealt in such things, tires worn smooth from many miles on many roads, and the rubble of the excavation, hummocked and chalky white and full of grass and weeds. And these were set among older ruins. The small old farm building, perhaps from the last century, far to the right at the end of the overgrown track at the foot of the hill, and all the many farm buildings, old or very old, at the back of Jack's cottage. Along the droveway, the beehives, the house-shaped old rick, the old stone house, ruined walls alone, surrounded by trees which, tall and overhanging the ruin when I had first seen them, were now 10 years older, vegetable nature moving on, stone immovable. And in the walk in the other direction, away from the old Land Rover run of the old manager, the great Swiss rolls of hay still stacked in the space between the wood, how grown, and the hill of larks, with the ancient barrows at the top, part of the pimpling of the downs as seen against the sky, those rolls of hay now as black and as earthlike as the older bales that, at the other end of the droveway, had indeed, below their tattered plastic sheeting, turned to earth. Grass to hay to earth. My own time here was coming to an end, my time in the manor cottage and in that particular part of the valley, my second childhood of seeing and learning, my second life, so far away from my first. I had tried almost from the beginning to make myself ready for this end. After the glory and surprise of the first spring on the river banks, the new reeds, the water clearing to crystal, freshing out, as I learned to say, but this water green and dark with olive blue suggestions and with illusory depth where it reflected the thick, succulent growth on the banks, and especially below trees. After that first spring I would say, "At least I had a spring here." And then I said, "At least I had a spring and summer here." And, "At least I've had a year here." And so it went on, as the years passed. Until time began to telescope, and experience itself began to change, the new season not truly new anymore, bringing less of new experience than reminders of the old. One had begun to stack away the years, to count them, to take pleasure in the counting, accumulation. One autumn afternoon I had a slight choking fit as I walked past Jack's old cottage and the derelict old farmyard. The fit passed by the time I had got round the corner, cleared the farmyard, and left behind the old metal and tangled wire and timber junk below the beeches. Not the birches near the fire pit, they were on the other side of the way. These beeches were at the edge of the farmyard, Big trees now in their prime, their lowest branches very low, providing a wonderful, rich, enclosing shade in the summer that made me think of George Borrow and his wanderings in the Romany Rye and Lavengro. Past the beeches and the farm, in the familiar solitude of the grassy way, I began to breathe easily again. Some irritation, something in the air around the farmyard, some passing allergy, I thought, and did nothing about it when I went home. That evening the fit returned. It was like a continuation of the moment near Jack's cottage, but this time it stayed with me, and within 2 or 3 hours I was seriously ill. This was the illness that did away with whatever remained of youthfulness in me, and much had remained, diminished my energy, and pushed me week by week, during my convalescence, month by month, into middle age. It was the end, for me, of the manor cottage as well. The downs, the uplands, the river and its banks, the geography here was simple. Water drained off the downs to the river. After rain, on the paved lane beside the windbreak, there were the little pebbled rivulets I had minutely observed running between the asphalt edge and the grass verge, down to the public road and then, over the road surface or through culverts, towards the river. Little rivulets like that, but charged with beech mast, now fresh, now old, ran past my kitchen door after rain, and left little tide racks, almost, of beech mast debris all down the path. My cottage was cold. The solid stone and flint walls which I loved, for the warm color of the stone especially, kept in this cold. The beech trees that embowered it also kept out the sun. Even in summer it never got warm. Even during the summer drought that killed the old mock orange shrub I needed heat at night. The beauty of the place, the great love I had grown to feel for it, greater than for any other place I had known, had kept me there too long. My health had suffered. But I couldn't say then, and can't say now, that I minded. There is some kind of exchange always. For me, for the writer's gift and freedom, the labor and disappointments of the writing life, and the being away from my home, for that loss, for having no place of my own, this gift of the second life in Wiltshire, the second, happier childhood as it were, the second arrival, but with an adult's perception, at a knowledge of natural things, together with the fulfillment of the child's dream of the safe house in the wood. But there was the cold of the cottage, and the damp and mist of the glorious river bank, and the illnesses that come to people who have developed or inherited weak lungs. It was some time before I went walking again. I was working on a big book. At a certain stage in that kind of labor, energy becomes one, mental energy, physical energy, the use of one depleting the other. And when I was sufficiently recovered, most of my energy went on my book. I was also, sadly, preparing to leave. Just a few miles away, on a dry down, I was converting 2 derelict agricultural cottages into a house. The cottages had been built 80 years or so before on the site of an old agricultural hamlet with a very old name. The old hamlet had disappeared. Nothing remained of it except a few level areas, little green platforms or terraces, close to one another, in certain meadows. During my own building work, old brick walls and brick foundations from the last century, and the black earth of old latrines were dug up where, with smooth green slopes all around, I had been expecting only chalk. The walls and foundations of workers' houses, generations of agricultural workers had lived on the site. And even in the pair of cottages I was renovating, the cottages that had been built early in the century over the foundations and debris of the old hamlet, many generations of workers, or many different people, had lived. Now I, an outsider, was altering the appearance of the land a little, doing what I had been aware of others doing, creating a potential ruin. And later, after I had moved there, when old people came to look at the cottages where they had lived or visited, I felt ashamed. And once, when a very old lady, not far from death, was brought by her grandson to look at the cottage where as a girl she had lived for a summer with her shepherd grandfather, and was so bewildered by the changed cottage she found that she thought she had come to the wrong place. Once I pretended I didn't live there. I should have made a clean break, gone elsewhere. But having cut myself off from my first life, and having had, unexpectedly, and 20 years after that earlier casting off, the good fortune to have found a second life, I was unwilling to move too far. I wanted to stay with what I had found. I wanted to recreate, so far as it was possible, what I had found in the manor cottage. One day, perhaps 9 or 10 months after I had fallen ill, I went on my old walk. New associations now, to add to the old. And, as if to match my mood, I saw, almost as soon as I began to go down the hill beside the windbreak, a greater change at the bottom of the valley than any I had known. What had been the row of 3 farm cottages, one of which had been Jack's, was being converted into one big house. The basic work had been done. The 3 cottages, or so it appeared from the outside, had been turned into a large living room. New spaces or rooms had been added to this big central room. The roof of the house was being put on, new, red-blonde rafters. The design of the house was not elegant, but it was going to be roomy and comfortable, and every window would give a staggering green view of the droveway, or the slopes of the downs, the woods of birch and beech, or the lines of blackthorn and hawthorn along the lateral field lanes. Most of the old farm buildings had gone, but some at the back were still there, among them the old barn with the high loading window and the projecting metal bracket where a pulley and cable would once have helped to lift sacks or bales from loaded wagons and swing them into place inside. The builders were working on the roof, hanging slates fast. The van with the builder's name was on the droveway, where once Jack's geese had roamed. There was a radio playing loudly somewhere in the unfinished, hollow, reverberating building. The builders, town people, were more unwelcoming than the town farm workers had been. How exposed a house looks when it becomes a site for builders, how stripped of sanctity, when a room, once intimate, becomes mere space. Jack's cottage, whose interior I had never seen until now, had been reduced, without side wall or middle flooring, to pure builder's space, and at this stage of building was still pure space, like the space within the ruined stone-walled house with the big sycamores further along the droveway. Somewhere in that space Jack had made his bravest decision, to leave his deathbed for the last Christmas season with his friends, in the so ordinary public house not far from the end of the droveway. And that was the space to which, with what illness, delirium, resignation, or perhaps reconciliation, he had returned to die. I saw this new building going up in summer, in white chalk dust. But in winter, as I knew, the site had been one of mud and water, settling at the bottom of the valley, mud and water many inches deep. That was the source of the damp that had given Jack his bronchitis and his pneumonia. But now that wet and damp had been dealt with, all the ground that had been Jack's garden and goose ground, and the gardens or grass over areas of the other cottages, all that had been concreted over, to create a forecourt for the big house. At the back, the concrete floor of Jack's greenhouse was not to be seen. The area had been incorporated into the new living space of the big house. So at last, just as the house was cleansed of Jack's life and death, so the ground he had tended finally disappeared. But surely below all that concrete over his garden some seed, some root, would survive, and one day perhaps, when the concrete was taken up, as surely one day it would be taken up, since few dwelling places are eternal, one day perhaps some memory of Jack, preserved in some shrub or flower or vine, would come to life again. With that building of a big house where once, perhaps for centuries, had stood the cottages or dwellings of farm or country laborers, a cycle had been completed. Once there would have been many hamlets, settlements of farm workers and shepherds, near the fording places along the river. These hamlets had dwindled. They had dwindled fast with the coming of machinery. Fewer hands had been needed, and then, when sheep stopped being kept, even shepherds were not needed. The garden of the manor, the forested orchard, lay partly on the site of one vanished hamlet. Such building over would have occurred many times before. The duplicate name of the hamlet or village, Waldeshaw, the same word, for forest or wood, in 2 tribal languages, both long since absorbed into other languages. The very name spoke of invaders from across the sea and of ancient wars and dispossessions here, along the picturesque river and the wet meadows. This history had repeated, had radiated outwards, as it were, much of the wealth for the Victorian Edwardian manor, its gardens and ancillary buildings, had come from the Empire, ventures abroad. Once the manor estate had covered many of the acres of my afternoon walks. But its glory had lasted 1 generation. The family had moved elsewhere. The estate had become the manor and grounds alone. It had shed its farms and land. Others had taken over those acres, built new big houses in villages or on the sites of hamlets once full of working people. And now the last of the peasant or farm cottages along the drove-way had been taken over. What had once been judged a situation suitable only for agricultural cottages, next to a farm, far from roads and services, had become desirable. The farm had gone, the very distance from the public road was a blessing. And so, the quality or attributes of the site changing, the past had been abolished. I had lived, very soon after coming to the valley, with the idea of change, of the imminent dissolution of the perfection I had found. It had given a poignancy to the beauty I had experienced, the passing of the seasons. I had promised myself again and again, every spring, every autumn, to get a camera, or at least to relearn how to use the one I owned, to record the drove-way and the ruined house below the sycamores and the gypsy caravan and the farm buildings and Jack's cottage and garden and goose ground. But I had never once taken a camera on my walks, and perhaps because I had no physical record of these things, they had an added poignancy, since they very soon began to exist only in my head. I had thought that because of my insecure past, peasant India, colonial Trinidad, my own family circumstances, the colonial smallness that didn't consort with the grandeur of my ambition, my uprooting of myself for a writing career, my coming to England with so little, and the very little I still had to fall back on. I had thought that because of this I had been given an especially tender or raw sense of an unaccommodating world. I had seen Jack as solid, rooted in his earth. But I had also seen him as something from the past, a remnant, something that would be swept away before my camera would get the pictures. My ideas about Jack were wrong. He was not exactly a remnant. He had created his own life, his own world, almost his own continent. But the world about him, which he so enjoyed and used, was too precious not to be used by others. And it was only when he had gone, when the town workers who had replaced him had gone, it was only then that I saw how tenuous, really, the hold of all of these people had been on the land they worked or lived in. Jack himself had disregarded the tenuousness of his hold on the land, just as, not seeing what others saw, he had created a garden on the edge of a swamp and a ruined farmyard, had responded to and found glory in the seasons. All around him was ruin, and all around, in a deeper way, was change, and a reminder of the brevity of the cycles of growth and creation. But he had sensed that life and man were the true mysteries, and he had asserted the primacy of these with something like religion. The bravest and most religious thing about his life was his way of dying, the way he had asserted, at the very end, the primacy not of what was beyond life, but life itself. My time was over in the valley, that particular, rhythmical time of manor cottage and grounds and the special signs there of the seasons, and walks on the downs and the river bank. And I felt like that the second life I had been granted had ended, though I did not move far. The cottages I had been renovating were on the same bus route, the bus that made fewer trips, with fewer passengers, for more and more money. One day a middle-aged woman spoke to me. Some of the people on the bus spoke to me, some, even after 12 years, never did. I did not recognize the woman who spoke to me. She said, "Jack." Jack's wife. And then I remembered her face and the cadaverous, wicked-eyed face of her father. She spoke of Jack, always, in this distant way, as though speaking of another person altogether, someone she had known rather than lived with. She said, "It's the hair you didn't recognize." She fingered her hair. "It was short," she said. "Jack liked it long. He liked me to wear it in a bun." This was something new about Jack. From a distance, his own beard, and his upright posture, had made him look like a romantic, something like an early socialist, in my fantasy, and perhaps he had copied the beard from an older person. Perhaps he had, after all, self-consciously lived out a certain kind of life. Perhaps in his own way he had been a tyrant, imposing, in addition to the long hair and the bun, a style and way of life that had been irksome to his wife. She lived now in a small settlement of council houses in a small town in another valley. She liked the area, her house, her neighbors. She found it strange, no more than that a big house should have been put up where she had lived for all those years. She said, Isn't it funny what they do? For her, Jack's wife, the move away from the cottage had been good. She saw her life as a small success story. Father a forester, a gamekeeper of sorts, Jack the farm worker, the gardener, and now she half a townswoman. One cycle for me, in my cottage, in the grounds of the manor, another cycle on the farm, among the farm buildings, another cycle in the life of Jack's wife.